I declare open this hearing of the Senate Community Affairs Legislation Committee's inquiry into the provisions of the Paid Parental Leave Amendment, Improvements for Families and Gender Equality Bill 2022. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'm here in Adelaide and I'm on Kaurna land and pay my respect to Kaurna elders past and present. I extend that respect as well to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening today. The committee will be conducting today's hearing via video conference. My name is Senator Marielle Smith. I'm the chair of the committee, and joining me by video conference today are Senator Slade Brockman, Senator Larissa Waters and Senator Barbara Pocock. These are public proceedings being video streamed live via the Parliament's website, and a Hansard transcript is being made. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee that they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence. Witnesses also have a right to request to be heard in camera. I remind committee members and witnesses who are appearing via video conference and who are not speaking to please mute their microphones. I would like to start with representatives from the Australian Council of Trade Unions and the Shop Distributive and Allied Employees Association. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, could we please have your full names and the capacity in which you appear today? And we'll start with Atchu.
Thank you, Senator and Chair. I'm Alessandra Peldover-McClelland, otherwise known as Sasha, Senior Legal Industrial Officer at the Australian Council of Trade Unions.
Great, welcome Sasha. And from the SDA?
Thank you, Senator. I'm Katie Biddlestone. I'm the National Women's Officer from the Shop Distributive and Allied Employees Association.
Excellent, welcome to you as well. I'd like to invite you both to make a short opening statement if you wish to, and then following your remarks, we'll move to questions from senators.
Thank you, Chair. Are you happy for me to proceed? Thank you. Good morning, Chair and Senators. I acknowledge I'm speaking to you from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in Sydney. Thank you for the opportunity to make a submission and appear before the committee today. The ACTU welcomes and supports this bill, which is an important first step in delivering crucial reforms to the Paid Parental Leave Act and the Commonwealth Paid Parental Leave Scheme that have been advocated for by unions and others for many years. The ACTU also welcomes and commends the commitment to increase paid parental leave to 26 weeks by 2026. The bill contains important reforms that will make paid parental leave more accessible, more flexible and gender neutral, including by removing the concepts of primary, secondary and tertiary claimants, removing the requirement that primary claimants must be birth parents, allowing all PPL to be taken flexibly within 2 years of birth or adoption, reserving 2 weeks on a use it or lose it basis for each parent, introducing a new family income test, and enabling fathers and partners to receive parental leave pay, regardless of whether the birth parent meets the income test or residency requirements. The ACTU makes 3 recommendations in its submission that will strengthen the bill, the Paid Parental Leave Scheme and the broader parental leave framework. Firstly, inclusive language should be used in the bill and the Paid Parental Leave Act to ensure that it includes all people who become pregnant and who give birth. Secondly, the Paid Parental Leave Scheme needs to be improved and expanded further, including by making the 26 weeks available from commencement of the bill, extending the scheme to 52 weeks by 2030, increasing the rate of pay from its low level of the national minimum wage, providing further incentives for shared parenting, paying superannuation on top, removing the work test, and making it available to all workers who need it. These changes are necessary to increase women's workforce participation, facilitate more equal sharing of caring responsibilities between men and women, close the gender pay gap and give children the best possible start in life. Thirdly, the rights and protections of working parents and carers need to be strengthened. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. We'll come to the SDA now. Do you have an opening statement?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Chair and Senators. I acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in Melbourne. Thank you for the opportunity to make a submission and also to appear before the committee today. In 2021, the SDA partnered with the University of New South Wales to conduct the first ever study of work and care in retail, warehousing and fast food industries. 6,500 members responded to the survey. 55% surveyed provide regular care to a child or adult, and 30% were a parent of a child under 18. The report found that SDA members provide care at disproportionately high rates when compared to the national population, and they do this in low-income households. The care contribution they make to our society and economy is enormous, but comes at great personal cost, financially, for their family life and in relation to their health. The research examined our members' experience taking parental leave. As low-paid workers living in low-income households, the ability to take time off work following the birth or adoption of a child is intrinsically linked to access to ongoing income in the form of paid leave. Saving for time off for the birth of a child is not an option for most low-income workers, so they rely heavily on paid leave they can access from the government and from their employer. One member commented, "It felt like it wasn't long enough, but we couldn't survive unless I went back to work. My leave taken off was all dependent on when government leave would end." Despite the government scheme being in place for more than a decade and many employers providing paid parental leave, many of our members who need it most are missing out, indicating large gaps in access to unpaid and paid parental leave. All workers should have access to parental leave, especially low-paid workers. In industries such as retail and fast food, where employment is often insecure and unpredictable, and employers have little control over hours, requirements to be permanent, meet a required length of service, or a work test for eligibility can serve as an additional punishment. One casual worker commented that "I'm not getting government paid leave and I have to return to work for financial crisis, but I'm worried about my child and how I will manage." While the length of parental leave SDA members take has significantly increased since the introduction of the government scheme, the large majority of SDA members who accessed parental leave said they would have preferred more time away from work. Both mothers and fathers voiced the struggle they face making the decision between taking time off with their baby and earning an income, and the sacrifices that come with it. One mother said, "It was definitely too soon back, but I could not afford more time off." Another said that they missed so many of their baby's first walk, first word. And one father said, "As a dad, I think it is important to get time off to be with a newborn and wife. I do appreciate 2 weeks, but feel it's not enough, especially if you want to take a hands-on approach or in the case that your partner has had complications." The SDA welcomes and supports the positive improvements proposed in the bill, particularly changes towards a more flexible and gender-neutral model, improvements to the quantum to encourage fathers and partners to take parental leave to promote more equal sharing of care, and changes to the income test and a commitment to increase the payment to 26 weeks. However, the SDA does make several recommendations for improvements to the bill that would address some of the gaps identified in our report and will have the greatest impact for the lowest paid workers, including an immediate increase in the quantum to 26 weeks and a plan to extend that out to 52 weeks, that it be accessible to all workers, and that the superannuation guarantee be paid on all forms of parental leave. Thank you, and happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. I think there are questions from quite a few of us this morning on your submission. I'd like to thank you for the work you've put in to presenting here today. Senators, I'm going to go to Senator Pocock first. I'll come to you, Senator Waters. I've got some questions and then we'll see how Senator Brockman goes. Over to you, Senator Pocock. Senator, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Chair, and thank you both for your submissions and the work in both your organisations on these and so many other issues. I wanted to go to the question of the trajectory towards 52 weeks. I think you're both saying you're welcoming 26 weeks, but you're suggesting, I think you said from the ACTU, Alessandra, that you'd like to see 52 weeks by 2030. I just wonder whether your organisations have a perspective about how that would be achieved over time.
Thank you, Senator. We have not as yet done the work of stepping that out, what that would look like over those years, those 4 years. So I can take that on notice and come back to you. but certainly that is the ACTU policy position that it should be 52 weeks by 2030.
Yeah.
Thank you, Senator. I just add, we haven't included a timeline in our submission in relation to that, but that is something that we see as the ultimate objective in terms of improvements under the scheme.
Thank you. And I must say, as Chair of the Work and Care Select Committee, which will report shortly, we have heard a lot of evidence in favour of 52 weeks. So I'm certainly an enthusiast for that, but I wondered if you had a timeline. And we'd be interested to hear if you have any thoughts about how that could be, what would be the process to get there. I wonder if you could tell us a little more about who's missing out at present, your recommendations about a more inclusive system. What proportion of workers do you think are not eligible at present, and anything you can tell us about their characteristics?
Katie, would you like to go first with some specific examples, and then I can make some broader comments?
Happy to do that. Thank you. Thanks for the question, Senator. You'll note from our report that we were actually surprised with some of the data. I think that even we sort of had a bit of a perception, given that a lot of employers in retail and fast food now provide paid parental leave as well, and given that the government scheme has been in place for such a long time, that most of our members would be accessing parental leave, but we found that there was still a significant proportion who were not accessing either unpaid or paid parental leave on the birth of a child. And looking at our members and those who may have missed out, we think that the likely reasons for that will be in relation to not meeting some of the eligibility requirements. One of those may be in terms of their status and length of service, particularly for unpaid parental leave with the 12 months for regular casuals. And when you look at the paid parental leave scheme, it would be in relation to meeting the work test potentially. So given that it's that you have to work 10 months out of 13 and meet a certain number of hours, we would find that some of our members would miss out due to that work test. We're also talking about industries that have insecure and precarious employment. Our members often have little control over the hours that they get. So despite the fact that they're ready and willing to work, they may not meet the work test because their employer has not given them enough hours for them to be able to meet that work test. So they're sort of punished while they're working, and then potentially there is a punishment in terms of missing out on the paid parental leave scheme as well.
Thanks, Katie.
Thank you. And my broader comments are very much in line with what the SDA has just outlined. We find that the workers who are missing out on the paid parental leave payment are often the ones who need the safety net the most, and they're missing out because of the nature of their employment. So they're often employed on an insecure or precarious basis, such as being casual or on a temporary or fixed term contract, or they just simply haven't worked long enough prior to the birth, which might result in them being ineligible under the paid parental leave scheme. And this is why we say that the work test should be revisited, particularly in light of the prevalence of insecure work and the changing nature of employment. Our position is that the paid parental leave scheme should be available to all workers who need an income to support them while they're taking that time to care for their children. And this includes, as I've said, workers who are in insecure work, so casual, temporary, fixed-term contracts, but also workers who are on visas, who currently don't meet the residency requirement test, workers on any period of paid or unpaid leave who might miss out because they're not meeting that work test, and also parents of children who are not their own biologically or have not been adopted. So this includes parents of children who are on permanent care orders, and parents who might need paid parental leave for assisted reproduction or fertility treatment, surrogacy arrangements, kinship placements. It's our understanding that currently paid parental leave does include surrogacy arrangements, but that perhaps unpaid parental leave entitlements don't always cover everyone involved in a surrogacy arrangement, and the same for fostering arrangements. So we'd like to see that extended as well, because obviously these kinds of families are increasing and should be included in the safety net that all families should have access to.
Have I got time for one more question, Senator Smith? Thank you. You made a suggestion for a higher rate of payment. I think from the ACT, you're probably supported also by the SDA. Have you got thoughts about what that should look like and how it should be funded? Have you given any sort of consideration to that architecture?
Thank you, Senator. We did include in our submission the suggestion that it could be first phased up in an incremental way. So, for example, you could phase it up first to what we're terming a living wage, which is 60% of the median wage, before increasing it further to a replacement wage. So you could have a phased approach like you do with extending the quantum to introduce this change over time. In terms of how it's funded, we don't have specific suggestions about how to fund that, except to make the broad and obvious points that these are also investments that will have economic dividends in terms of, women's increased workforce participation, keeping women connected to the workforce, providing greater financial security for women, promoting the health and well-being of families. And, these measures will contribute to closing the gender pay gap, but also lead to increased government revenue in the form of taxes and reduced government spending in some areas. For example, the spending that's currently required to deal with the increasing problem of increasing rates of homelessness and poverty amongst older women because they're retiring with so much less superannuation than men. So whilst we don't have specific suggestions on the funding, and again, I can take that on notice and come back to you, we do say that these are investments that will produce their own economic dividends and benefits over time.
Thank you. And I strongly support what you're saying about an investment approach to it. And also you've clearly drawn our attention to the kind of people who are missing out. And they're often the most low paid, the most unpredictable earnings, probably the ones who families will benefit most from stability in that early phase of a new family's creation. So last question from me. You recommended in favour of
an extra one in there, Barbara, but that's okay.
Sorry?
You snuck an extra one in there, but that's okay. They're good questions.
Have I got time for one more or done? Yeah, so you recommended in favour of an increased proportion of use it or lose it. Do you have a view about how much greater should it be than 2 weeks?
We think that it should be phased up as the quantum increases to 26 weeks, but we are reserving our position on exactly how much that should be. And we are aware that this is the subject of advice from academics and the Women's Equality Economic Task Force. So we don't want to preempt what that advice says, because it is being conducted by people who are real experts in this field. And we look forward to saying what it says, and we will form a view after that advice and research has been released. But definitely it's something that needs to be expanded. And we also say in our submission that other forms of incentives, such as bonus leave for parents who share their leave or who take their allocated portion, should also be considered to further motivate fathers and partners to get involved.
Thank you, and thank you, Chair. Thanks for your evidence.
Thank you. Senator Waters.
Thanks, Chair. Hi there, Sasha and Katie and all of the other senators and Chair. I hope you can hear me okay. Barb's asked a lot of the questions that I'm also interested in. We're all passionate about this area, so thanks for your time and your expertise so far and in your submission. I'm interested in your proposal to increase PPL up to 52 weeks by 2030. I know you've just said that you haven't yet stepped out the pathway to get there, but I'm interested in whether you've raised this issue with government and put that on their agenda, and what their response has been.
Thank you, Senator. I am not entirely sure. I apologise, so I'll have to take that one on notice as well. I imagine we have, but I just can't say with any certainty. I have only been at the ACTU for a short period of time. So, yes, I'll have to come back to you on that.
No problems. Katie, for the SDA, is this something that you've raised with government, the increase up to 52 weeks?
We haven't as yet, no, but it is something that we do intend to do.
Okay. And can I just ask the same question about the addition of super onto PPL? Because my understanding is it's a broadly accepted proposal by many of the academics and people interested in this field, and yet it was missing from the government scheme. Is the addition of super something that you're actively pushing for with government? And again, what's their response been, if so?
Again, this is subject to me confirming this, but I do believe that this has been a part of our policy platform for a very long time and something that we've included in a number of submissions and representations to government. And it is something that we are actively pushing currently.
This is also something that the SDA has been advocating for some time. We actually brought delegations of our members to Parliament to meet with various members over the last couple of years. Part of that was to push for the removal of the 450 threshold, but the other really key issue in relation to superannuation for us and our members is the payment of the superannuation on parental leave.
Well, well done in your role in getting the 450 threshold removed. We're very pleased to see that go as well. Obviously, that benefits low-income women the most. Can I just ask, and I think you mentioned this before, but I want to understand, I want to make sure I've got what you said correct. In your model, where there's 52 weeks by 2030, who's paying? Is that an employer-paid scheme or a government-funded scheme?
No, so we have said that it should be part of the Commonwealth Paid Parental Leave Scheme, that 52 weeks by 2030.
Okay.
And that each parent should have access to that eventually, which would give families or a two-parent household an ability to access up to 104 weeks of paid leave, which they could share between them. And that would align with the amount of unpaid parental leave that parents can access under the National Employment Standards.
And at replacement wage?
That is the ultimate position, yes, at replacement wage. But as I said previously, we acknowledge that they need to be phased up through various steps.
Okay, great. Can you tell me what you think is missing from this bill? What needs to be added to make it world's best practice?
Okay, yeah, sure. So there's a few different categories of things, I think. The first is a comment on the language of the bill, which is obviously an easy fix, and that is recommendation 1 of our submission. And that's just to ensure that the language in there is inclusive. The bill refers mostly to uses the term birth mother. The explanatory memorandum uses a mix of the term birth parent and birth mother, and also uses some inconsistent concepts of what a birth parent is. So our position is, the term birth parent is inclusive of transgender, intersex and gender diverse parents, whereas the term birth mother excludes some people. So the term birth parent should be used in the bill, in the Act, because the Act will also contain other references, and the explanatory memorandum should make it clear what is meant by the term birth parent, that it's the person who gives birth, not both biological parents, for example. So that's recommendation 1. Our recommendation 2 goes to your question around what is needed to make it sort of best practice around the world. And, our submission goes into what does best practice look like. And that's all of the things we've been talking about. So 52 weeks by 2030, pay it at a higher rate, pay superannuation on it, remove or shorten that work test, and promote incentives for shared parenting. And we've explored a lot of those today already. But just to note that, there are countries we can look to that do this really well, where they've managed to increase shared parenting through the use of certain policy settings, including paying it at a higher rate and incentives to share, and that we really need further reforms because our current scheme is the second worst in the developed world. And even with the changes, you know, I think we're only going up a few spots in terms of what the scheme will provide once the changes in the bill are implemented. And then the third lot of recommendations kind of relate more broadly to the broader parental leave framework. So currently discrimination against parents is just pervasive and widespread despite all of our anti-discrimination laws. This has all remained pretty unchanged, and it's just all too common for women to find themselves, you know, unemployed, restructured out of a job, demoted, or the victim of some adverse action during or shortly after a period of parental leave, despite the existing legislative protections. So what we're saying is we really need to strengthen those protections to make sure the laws are achieving their intended purpose. So, for example, strengthening the existing return to work guarantee in the Fair Work Act and making it harder for employers to abolish jobs while people are on parental leave. And then there are a few other rights and entitlements that we've recommended as part of recommendation 3, which would expand the parental leave framework. So, for example, we've advocated for a new entitlement for grandparental leave, acknowledging the role that so many grandparents play in caring for children and enabling parents to return to work in some form. So recognising that in our laws. Paid breastfeeding breaks and appropriate facilities to do that in. So many women report that this is a barrier for them returning to work because their employers tell them, well, you can't do that. You'll have to do that at home or quit. So that's a really fundamental protection that is not going to cost very much, that would make a huge difference to parents and particularly women. And then finally, the recognition of periods of unpaid parental leave as active service. So there are a number of reasons for this. It would help with keeping annual salary increments up to date and therefore, you know, reducing the gender pay gap. It would mean that parents can accrue leave while they're on leave so they don't come back to work with nothing, having exhausted all of their leave entitlements, so that if they need to take leave, which is likely when they've got a new child, they have to resort to unpaid leave and therefore they're going backwards again in terms of pay and super. So that was a very long answer.
Yeah, oh, they're great. I really love those last few proposals in particular. And as a breastfeeding advocate, as I'm sure many of us are, can you just, with probably my last question, Chair, if there's time, could you just elaborate for me on the amount of breastfeeding leave you're envisaging? And can you talk about the provision of facilities that you've suggested? And what else needs to be done so that employers are aware that you can't just pump at home? You know, for physical reasons, you need to pump on a regular basis and to keep your milk flow and for your own comfort. If you could just give me a little bit more detail on that, I'm particularly interested in that. Thank you.
Yes, of course, Senator. And again, this might be something I need to provide more detail in and come back to you. But I think the only way we can get employers to that point of acknowledging that this is needed is to put it in a form of leave, or paid breastfeeding breaks is how we've labelled it. I think one really positive step the government could take to assist this is to ratify the ILO convention. I think it's 183, the maternity leave convention, which talks about the need for paid breastfeeding breaks and facilities. So I think the only way to get employers on board with this is to put it into the industrial safety net and make sure that employees have access to it.
And have more women in charge so culture changes. Thank you for your evidence today. Thanks, Chair. That's all from me.
Thanks, Senator Waters. I've got some questions, but Senator Brockman, are you on the line? Did you have questions, or are you happy for me to take the time?
Absolutely. Thank you, Chair. Just.
Oh, well, sorry, I'm going to go to my questions first, then Senator Brockman, and I'll come to you afterwards. So I think quite a few of the policy issues I wanted to talk to you about have been covered off. But just it's probably one for the ACTU in terms of the industrial protections needed to protect women from discrimination of taking paid parental leave. Can I just confirm, is it your perspective that there aren't any provisions to protect women from discrimination within our existing industrial arrangements, or that there are some protections, just employers aren't really adhering to them, and we need more support in making sure women aren't discriminated for taking parental leave?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things here. Of course, our framework does contain protections against discrimination against women on the basis of pregnancy or caring responsibilities and their sex generally. So absolutely those provisions exist, but as we've all sort of been, learning over the last few years, those protections often aren't doing what they were intended to do. We've had over 30 years of the Sex Discrimination Act, and the dial on sexual harassment hasn't moved, which is why we've obviously seen all of the Respect at Work changes come through, which is excellent. So what we're saying is we need to strengthen those protections. And we've got some specific suggestions in the submission about how to do that. So just to give you a couple of examples, there's the right to return guarantee in the Fair Work Act. That currently it's not strong enough. It doesn't actually achieve what it's trying to achieve because it's just too easy to abolish a job, restructure a job, or fire someone while they're on parental leave. There is not enough accountability for employers to make sure that that doesn't happen. So a couple of things you could do is limit the ability of employers to restructure or abolish the jobs of employees who are on unpaid parental leave. You could introduce strict liability or increase penalties for those things. And you could place a positive duty on employers to reasonably accommodate the needs of workers who are pregnant or have family responsibilities, including by preserving their jobs when they're on unpaid leave. So that's just a couple of examples about how you could strengthen the protections that we already have in place. Another quick one is the Fair Work Act obviously contains that reverse onus, whereas our anti-discrimination law doesn't. And so you could transplant that reverse onus into anti-discrimination law so that it's the employer that has the burden of proving that they didn't discriminate, rather than the burden being on the worker to prove that they did.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And in the SDA submission, when you're talking about expanding the value of paid parental leave to moving beyond a minimum wage replacement to an actual wage replacement, I think you spoke to Senator Waters about this, but can I just clarify, are you suggesting government should pay for a wage replacement, or are you interested in models where it's co-funded with employers?
No, yeah, we're looking at government-funded wage replacement, yes.
Okay.
And we have also included in our submission that the floor also or minimum be lifted from the national minimum wage to the national average earnings as well.
So what role do you see for employers in paid parental leave? Do you see this as an area where employers should be taking more responsibility, or an area which should be parked in the responsibility of government?
That's a good question. I think at the moment with the government scheme as it is, there is absolutely a role for employers to be providing paid parental leave so that their workers can have access to adequate levels of paid parental leave. With a phasing in of 52 weeks, we might see that employers have an opportunity to reduce that, or they could retain that payment so that they get the benefits of, being an employer of choice, for example, or ensuring that they have attachment to that employee and that employee returns to that workplace.
And for the ACTU, what role do you see for business in the expansion and further enhancement of this scheme?
Yeah, it is an interesting question and one that I might need to consider further, but I guess our position currently is the only way to ensure that all workers have this safety net is if it's government funded, because there's currently no requirement on employers to do anything other than provide unpaid parental leave. However, if you were to change that and say there is now a requirement on employers to provide, for example, 3 months, 6 months, paid parental leave at the worker's salary or at some agreed rate, then yes, you could, I guess, be getting into the co-funded model, which could also work. And then I guess there are questions that arise about the impact of that on certain employers and whether all employers are able to do that. And while we would love to see employers doing more in this space, that is perhaps a more complex model than just having it funded by government. But I think there are further ideas to explore there.
Okay, and you said at the start of your evidence that you both support this legislation. Is there anything technical with this legislation or from a drafting perspective that you have concerns with? I appreciate your evidence about hoping to see a further expansion of PPL and some additional changes in the supplementary and wraparound legislation, but as the bill is drafted, are you comfortable that the draft has a positive impact, or are there technical changes you want to see to the legislation before us?
Thank you, Chair. There's just the one technical change that I spoke to previously about the use of the term birth parent. I think it's really important that that term is used rather than birth mother. And the reason is like the entitlement to paid parental leave and the language used to describe that entitlement should include all people who give birth. It's the proper role of government to ensure that its services and programs responds to the needs of everybody, and this includes transgender, gender diverse and non-binary parents. So we think that's a really important technical change. As for the rest of the bill, we are very supportive of all of the changes that it's introducing.
Thank you. And is that the SDA's position as well?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, we're supportive of the bill as it is, but do support the recommendations of the ACTU as well.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. I'll just pass to Senator Brockman now. And if there's our next witnesses are on the line, we're just running a few minutes behind, but we'll come to you shortly. And we've got a bit extra time. We've had one witness drop out, so we won't miss anything there. But Senator Brockman?
Yeah, I'll be quick, Chair. I think there's broad acceptance of the change from 18 to 20 weeks and the increased flexibility among employers and employer groups. I think the one area where I probably still heard some concerns about this broad area of policy, and particularly in light of proposals such as the one you've mentioned to increase it to 52 weeks, is the flow-on consequence, particularly to smaller businesses who simply don't have the capacity to cover staff in the same way that larger businesses do. Have you put your minds to that in a policy sense and have any suggestions or sympathy for that question?
Senator, could you just clarify for me what the concern is exactly?
Oh, smaller employees who have to cover when they only have a small team, staff being absent for periods of time.
So my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that all employers, regardless of whether they're small business or not, have to provide 12 months of unpaid parental leave. Yeah, so I don't see how anything in this bill changes that fundamental position that they have to provide that. They also need to consider a right to extend it unless there are reasonable business grounds for refusing it. So they have to do that. They therefore have to cover the staff. So I'm not sure how this changes anything from the current legal obligations that employers have. Am I missing something in your question?
No.
Okay.
I'm happy to move on, Chair.
Okay. Thank you very much. We're actually bang on time, miraculously. So thank you very much for your attendance today and for providing evidence to us. I understand there might be a few things you're taking away, but we are moving pretty quickly on this report. So just to keep that in mind. And I also just wanted to thank the SDA particularly for that work and care report you've done. I think many of the committee members refer to that regularly. It's been a really helpful tool for us in understanding many of these issues. So thank you both, and you're free to log off now.
Thank you.
Okay. I now would like to welcome representatives from KPMG and the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. Thank you for appearing before the committee today. In regards to the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, I remind committee members that the Senate has resolved that an officer of a department of the Commonwealth or of a state shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. If a witness objects to answering a question, they should state the ground upon which the objection is made, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer having regard to the ground which is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. Commonwealth officers appearing today are also reminded of the Senate order specifying the process by which a claim of public interest immunity should be raised. A copy of the order is available from the Secretariat. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear, and we'll start with KPMG.
Sorry, good morning. My name's Alison Kitchen and I'm the Chairman of KPMG Australia.
Welcome, Ms Kitchen. And from the Workplace Gender Equality Agency?
Hello, Chair. It's Mary Wooldridge, the Director of the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. And can I just apologise, I'm not getting sound, I'm getting vision through WebEx, so I'm also dialing in. So hopefully the combination of the two is connecting. Thanks.
Okay, maybe hopefully the Secretariat might be able to have a look into what's going on there and we can get that resolved for you.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Simone McCurdy from WGEA and I am the Executive Capacity Building Manager.
Thank you and welcome to you all. We appreciate you taking the time to participate in our hearing. I'd just like to remind all committee members and witnesses who are appearing via video conference, which is all of us, if you're not speaking and you're not asking questions, could you please pop your microphones on mute? We'll now start with Ms Kitchen. Do you have an opening statement?
Yes, I do, if that's all right, Chair.
Yes, please proceed.
So I'd like to say, firstly, thank you very much for the opportunity to provide an opening statement. KPMG Australia welcomes the opportunity to provide a submission to the committee's inquiry into the Paid Parental Leave Amendment Bill and to appear before the committee today. KPMG has demonstrated our commitment in this area through a market-leading paid parental leave policy introduced in July 2021, which provides 26 weeks flexible parental leave for both parents, with no waiting periods, no tenure guidelines, and no distinction between primary and secondary carers. The impact of this has been very positive, and we have seen a 23% increase of men taking parental leave since the policy was introduced. Further, KPMG has a strong history in supporting reform that promotes gender equity in Australia. KPMG's Gender Equity Series, published over a number of years, proposes policy settings aimed at shifting the dial in several key areas, including parental equity, childcare, superannuation and parental leave. In April 2021, KPMG released the paper Enhancing Work-Life Balance, a Better System of Paid Parental Leave, which is referenced in the Bill's explanatory memoranda. The paper sets out recommendations for a restructured Commonwealth Paid Parental Leave scheme that would aim to overcome impediments to women's economic participation and help Australia move towards equal responsibility for raising children. Additionally, KPMG supports the inclusion of superannuation guarantee contributions in the Commonwealth Paid Parental Leave scheme, as set out in KPMG's report towards a more equal sharing of work. KPMG strongly supports this bill, and we note the ongoing work of the Women's Economic Equality Task Force on developing a use it or lose it model and expanding the scheme to 26 weeks. Again, we strongly support this work and we look forward to continuing to be part of the process to progress the important aspects of the scheme. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here again with WGEA, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Ms Kitchen. To WGEA, did you have an opening statement, Ms Wooldridge?
Yes.
It's going to be provided by Simone McCurdy.
Thank you.
Lovely.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly.
Can everybody hear me? Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you, Senator. My name is Dr. Simone McCurdy, and on behalf of our Director, Ms Mary Wooldridge, who joins us today and has just said good morning, we wish to thank the committee for the opportunity to provide our submission. I'd like to begin our opening remarks by noting that our submission is very much embedded and grounded in a private employment context. Our agency, WGEA, collects workplace gender equality data annually from private employers with more than 100 employees. WGEA has always positioned paid parental leave policy as a critical tool for driving gender equal outcomes in Australian workplaces. The proposed amendments before the committee today are very much considered a positive step towards building a more substantive gender equality across all employers. We can see that the amendments will likely encourage a more equal distribution of working care amongst parents. And in doing so, what this does is reduce the pervasive gender stereotypes that remain so firmly entrenched in the employment experiences of women, but also of men. What they do is lock fathers out of primary caregiving and women into a more variable participation in paid work over the life course. And our data affirms that these stereotypes sit at the very heart of women's disadvantage. They're evident in a persistent gender pay gap and in a workforce that remains gender segregated across organisations and occupation hierarchies. WGEA sees that the paid parental leave amendments proposed are very likely to encourage more fathers to participate in shared care, and that is a worthwhile pursuit in and of itself. But what they'll also do is bring the statutory scheme in line with more contemporary policy offerings, and they'll do so in ways that more closely resemble employer-funded policy. About 62% of our reporting organisations already offer some form of paid parental leave. However, we do want to note that employer-based policies are far from being a universal offering. We know that at least, or perhaps over a third now, of reporting employers do not offer any form of paid parental leave at all. Almost half of these employers suggest that the main reason that they do not provide that paid parental leave is because they feel the government-funded scheme provided gives adequate coverage. So in addition to highlighting that some working parents are going to remain relying on the statutory scheme for support when stepping away from work to care, it also highlights just how interdependent the private employer and statutory schemes are. And as has been noted in other submissions that will be examined today, this scheme will continue to evolve, and we'd like to say that WGEA will continue to support the paid parental leave amendments, and particularly those that bring a more gender equal experience of working care to the fore. I'll leave our statements there.
Thank you very much. Senator Brockman, would you like to kick us off with questions? Okay, we may have lost Senator Brockman. Senator Waters, did you have questions for these witnesses?
Yes, I do. Thanks, Chair. Sorry, I was just...
Sorry, Chair, I was just on mute.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
Okay,
Go ahead, Senator Waters.
No, that's all right. Well, Senator Waters, stand down. We'll come to you in a minute. Senator Brockman, please proceed.
Sorry, I was talking away to an empty room. Got to get back in the habit of doing this after the summer. I guess just one question from me. I think there's broad acceptance among the and even embracing among the business community about the idea of keeping people linked to their workplace and providing paid parental leave. The one area where I do still hear some concern is from smaller businesses who, rightly or wrongly, and maybe it's wrongly, they do have some concerns about the flow-on impacts of these kinds of policies. Do either of the witnesses have any comment about that? No?
I'm happy to leave it to WGEA to comment first. I don't think I can add anything to the comments made by the previous speaker in relation to the need to provide parental leave in any event, whether it's paid or not, and that not really changing anything from my experience.
I might just step in. Mary and I are going to keep looking at each other and going, do you want to take this? Look, certainly, Senator, understand the concerns around small business. I think they've always been there, even from inception, particularly when, the original bill was being provided. From a WGEA perspective, we don't actually cover in our data set small businesses or those with under 100 employees. What I would say though is that the reliance on the paid parental leave scheme is really important for all of those employers. So those that do not have an additional scheme, even small businesses often do, and I think that will particularly come to the fore in the coming years because they will also be trying to attract talent as they move out of post-COVID decline. So I think that particularly from increasing the participation of women and working parents in general, it would be something that would certainly be attractive, but also noting that they don't necessarily are able to provide it.
Okay, great.
And
thanks, Chair.
Could I add to that just a little bit of information, the data for you, Senator, because we do cut our paid parental leave by the size of organisation. So, and what you say is exactly right. So 86% of employers with 5,000 or more employees provide paid parental leave, but when you look at the 100 to 250 employees, that number's 57%. So you can see that there is a decline as the companies get smaller in relation to their ability or their decision making in relation to providing. The thing that's interesting as well, though, is that when you look over the last 8 years about the change in those numbers, the highest growth has been in companies of 500 to 999, where that's gone. It's been a 17% increase in that period of time of companies that have been providing it. So it's been something that larger companies can provide. The growth's been in those medium-sized, on the higher end of medium-sized organisations who are seeing it as an imperative. And then there's still, nearly half who don't at the smaller end of things. So, what these schemes provide is actually a mechanism by which that funding, which is often the blocker, is able to be provided to their employees. And what the employers then need to do is manage that time out of the workforce, manage that dynamic of the return to work, and, which is a challenge as well, but the financial element has been minimised because that's covered by the government scheme. So, this is good progress, particularly for those smaller companies.
Great, thank you very much.
Thanks, Senator Brockman. Senator Waters, over to you, and then I've got a few questions as well.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks everyone for appearing today and for your submissions and your verbal evidence so far. Just building on that last point, and firstly to WGEA, hi to the both of you. You've just given us some statistics about the various different sides of employers that offer additional employer-funded PPL on top of the government scheme. One of the other submitters to this inquiry, Dr. Leonora Risse, if I'm saying their name right, has also given us some stats, and they quote that around 50% of small businesses, around 60% of casuals, and more than 50% of businesses in particular male-dominated industries don't offer employer PPL. Is that consistent with the sort of figures that you're seeing? And importantly, what do you think that government should do to encourage more businesses, both of a size that you cover in your reporting, but also below the WGEA reporting threshold? What do you think the government should do to encourage those employers to offer employer-funded PPL?
I think, as I touched on before, the broader picture around paid parental leave is obviously as a lever for bringing greater gender equality more generally. So I guess I would be encouraging all employers to not just view paid parental leave in and of itself, but as a lever that will actually gain some momentum for broader gender equality in the workplace and the culture. I don't think it's any surprise to say that we are very much in a talent war at the moment in Australia across the labour market, and the community expectations are that both women, but increasingly fathers, are expecting to be able to step in and out of work in ways that allow them to care but also continue their careers. So in essence, what will happen and shift automatically will be this focus on talent and attracting talent and using these kinds of policies as a way to not just attract women, but also increasingly men. But the part that also gets missed is the retention aspect as well. So actually keeping them in the organisation. That's actually a very cost-effective way to make sure that, that women are staying the course and, of course, able to move up and down the line. In terms of the statistics, those statistics that Lenore has provided do align somewhat with our own. We do, as I said, it's not a universal offering, paid parental leave. Not all employers offer it. There is a significant amount that do. The way they offer it is variable though, and I think what the statutory scheme is able to do is start to create a mainstream expectation of how these should be offered. So degendering the leave, for example, and undoing the lines between primary and secondary carers has a really strong message to send to even to the employers that are offering it to, degender work in care. But I think, thinking back to what your original question was, we need to use paid parental leave to attract talent and, importantly, keep talent in these jobs and in the marketplace.
Can I ask a related question? And I'm not sure whether your either your existing or your proposed expanded gender equality indicators cover this, is the discrimination that parents experience when they return from work. And the ACTU just raised this with us just half an hour ago as well. Do you track how prevalent discrimination against returning parents after they've taken PPL, whether it's paid or an additional unpaid period? Do you track the amount of that? And do you have a view on what else can be done to try to reduce that?
I'll jump in. Mary, please jump in.
We'll have some views on the second part. What we track is return to work from parental leave. And so we do look at the attrition rates to get some data around that. What we would like to do, but we haven't been able to yet, is look at retention rates 12 months on, because obviously that time frame reflects the experience of that return to work. And we haven't, that's something on the would like to do in the future list that is a little bit difficult for employers to collect, and most don't, but is a very meaningful statistic. In terms of the experiences we talked about last week in estimates, there are new measures being included as part of Gender Equality Indicator 6 and the Respect at Work. While they're not specific to return to work, and that's an interesting thing to think about as we further work on our prevalence data. It definitely would capture broader perspectives on the experience, a discriminatory environment and those sorts of things. So that's a good suggestion that could be included in the work as it evolves.
And if I just might add to that, like in terms of, in addition to collecting that information, one of the things that the agency is doing, and particularly from my team in capacity building, is really looking at the transitions that employees make across their life course and helping employers to manage those transitions more effectively, and particularly to look for the gaps that we know that women and importantly men also fall through. So to give a really concrete example, one of the programs that we'll be looking at is helping managers to have forward conversations with both women and men when they indicate that there's a pregnancy forthcoming, so that it's not just assuming that the woman is going to take the leave, but that we actually help our organisations and our employers to draw on the policies that they already have in place and to use that as a way to perhaps sit down and talk with both the parents, not together but separately, but also not just locking men out of this, and looking at how they react and expect workers to be when they come back to work. I mean, I think it goes without saying that it is absolutely the biggest transition that anyone can make in their life course, and that transition to earning and caring is something that women have been doing for ages. What is not happening is that support around men. They effectively have two bosses, but their existing boss and also the boss at home now saying, when are you coming home? That's a massive shift, and I think employers again can do a lot more to get on the front foot in those, and WGEA will be helping them by equipping managers and building their capability to have those conversations.
Thank you. I think that's so important because that's how we shift culture as well. It's by setting those expectations. So strong agreement with what you've just said about the role for employers there to send those signals to men and male partners of pregnant people that, yeah, this isn't just the responsibility of the birth parent. This is a shared responsibility. So along those lines, can I ask now, Ms. Kitchen, your submission calls for use it or lose it provisions to increase to 5 weeks for each parent by 2026. Can you just talk me through how you've set that number and how does it compare with international practice?
Yes. So, well, first, can I just build on the points made by the previous people, and exactly the reason that we've implemented the policies we have are to destigmatise the taking of leave, particularly for men, and make it absolutely a normal practice that men would take the leave, and therefore they're more likely to take it, and therefore their employers are having to adapt and get used to it, and it does over time destigmatise, and that's certainly been our early experience. In relation to our specific proposal, what we wanted to do was make absolutely sure that we weren't in any way taking away from existing rights which already exist for parents. So we wanted to build on the 18 weeks for one carer and 2 weeks for the other. But we do believe we should over time. There's no specific reason for the 5 weeks. There's obviously a balance of affordability. What we do want to see, though, is progressively building it up over time so government can monitor how much it costs and manage its affordability. But we think giving bonus weeks for parents where there is more equal sharing of care, again, just further creates a positive financial incentive for parents to do that and further assists in destigmatising it from an employer's point of view. And we do believe that it's very important for all aspects of women's equity that we do destigmatise and create an environment where families can share care more equally. Those families where care is shared more equally from the start, first, the mother or the birth parent can go back to work knowing that their child's cared for at home without having to juggle childcare and other things. That helps. Second, it sets families up from a very young age with very equal sense of obligations for caring, which we think will then carry right through the family's life. And importantly, for children coming through, they grow up in a family where it's completely normal that both parents have that responsibility, and we hope that over the long term that they will grow into those sorts of parents themselves. So we see this as a lever with immediate benefit for increased women's participation in the workforce, but really good long-term structural change throughout society that does further make it easier for women to participate equally in the workforce and for men, frankly, to have equal access to caring and family responsibilities. And part of our experience, even though we've been only doing this ourselves for 18 months, is that many of our men want to have that access to care and welcome the opportunity for us to make it easier for them to share equally in those responsibilities. So that's really why we see it. And we do see those bonus weeks that give a positive incentive to parents to share more equally as a really key and important part of the next phase. And so we would welcome continuing to lobby hard on that once this round of changes is implemented.
Yes, that was going to be my second question to you, Ms. Kitchen. So thank you for answering that as well. And again, our party thinks the same. Strong support on the bonus weeks there to encourage shared care. Can I just have one last question, if there's time, Chair, just to both lots of witnesses? What is your position, or do you support the ACTU's proposal for a 52-week-a-year paid parental leave with super at replacement wage paid by government by 2030. What is your view on whether that's an optimal policy position?
Look, I'm happy to make a comment first. We've long been advocates of paying the super guarantee on paid parental leave. We do strongly believe that that should continue. It's the only form of leave, I believe, at the moment where there isn't super paid. So we strongly support that. As I said, we strongly support increasing over time to 26 weeks. Whether you would go further and whether you would pay more than the minimum wage is really, I think, a matter for government, given you've got very strong competing budget priorities. Certainly as a private employer at the moment, we pay at people's existing wage, and I know a number of my other colleagues at the BCA, where I represent the Women's Task Force, do that, but I understand that for small businesses there's an affordability issue there. I think the affordability is very much a matter for government in relation to that expansion to 52 weeks.
And I'm happy to answer from a WGEA perspective, because we won't comment on sort of policy that government should undertake, but what we are happy to comment on is, of course, what the private sector is doing and what the evidence base is. And, you know, what we are seeing with, you know, companies that are leading the way, like KPMG has been talking about, is those additional weeks, the more weeks that are available gives women and men more choice in relation to using it, and the way that they manage and balance care and working responsibilities, especially if there's provisions such as this bill has that allows them to be used flexibly, so that the choice is with the family in relation to how they return to work. And we're seeing lots of examples of women choosing to work 2 or 3 days a week and then taking 2 or 3 days of parental leave and balancing that as a transition back to work rather than one or the other. 83% of companies that are providing paid parental leave are paying superannuation on that leave. So in the private sector, that's very comprehensive. 9% of them are also paying superannuation on the government's paid parental leave scheme. So it's an interesting role that the private sector is seeing, that is a benefit that can be provided to keep to address the superannuation gap that women experience over at retirement age. And so, you know, there's very I think good examples in the private sector of leading practice that incorporates additional time, superannuation and flexibility that is seen as leading the way.
Chair, if there's time, I've just got a couple of follow-up questions, but I don't want to get in anybody else's way.
That's right. I might just ask a few questions, Senator Waters, and then we'll come back to you with remaining time. I'm sure there will be time for more. This probably goes to you, Ms. Kitchen. We've talked a bit about the benefits to employers and changing culture and practices with extending parental leave, particularly to partners. I'm just interested to you, as the chairman of a very substantial business, what have the benefits been for you at KPMG? What's the commercial imperative for providing these arrangements and indeed extending them?
Significant in a short term. We've seen it as a real tool for attracting talent, and we hear that regularly from people joining, that they join us because they know we're a family-friendly organisation. They feel that in the way that we do keep in touch with them while they're on paid parental leave. And we have gone out of our way to champion and celebrate in a very public way the people who are taking parental leave, and to get them to talk publicly within the firm about their experience on return to work. All of that in an environment where unemployment is still at record lows and we are in a war for talent has been very accretive to us in attracting and retaining people. I would also say very positively that those parts of the business that have experienced unprecedented take-up of men taking paid parental leave are experiencing the challenge of balancing backfilling roles working flexibly in unprecedented ways, and in solving it for our men, they're also solving it for our women, where we've long had a challenge. So I think that's been a benefit. And then similarly, because we have complete flexibility on how both parents use their leave, we have seen increasing models of people choosing to balance their care throughout the first year of a family's life, so the child can always be supported at home through a mix of both parents working part-time for a period. And so it's been an enormous enabler of flexible work for us. And it's been an interesting journey, I think, for us to work with our clients on how they experience more flexible teams and challenge themselves on whether they're working. And we've had very little complaint or pushback from our clients on lack of access to people as we've worked through those more flexible environments. So we feel it's been a huge positive for us in attraction and retention of talent. It's been a huge positive for us in teaching the business to be more agile and accommodating, not just of parental leave, but a whole range of other flexible issues, which, you know, in today's environment, when you've got a workforce of 10,000 people with a whole range of challenges outside their work life, I think has been a really good experiment. So we're feeling very good 18 months into this experiment about the benefits to us about it. And we hear a lot about it from our staff and from parts of the business.
And is this something you think the government could be doing more of to encourage businesses to do what you have done at KPMG and try to look creatively at the ways that they can build upon the government's scheme and work in this space?
Well, I think that is why we've been such a strong proponent of the use it or lose it model. I mean, at KPMG, we have 26 weeks available to either parent. So for those families where both families in a relationship work at KPMG, they get a shared 52 weeks. But that is why we think that if you do incentivise more equal sharing of care, that does create that new environment. And we also do think that by paying parental leave and therefore making it foolish for men not to take it, it will destigmatise it over time, even for those employers that we do anecdotally hear make it difficult for men to take parental leave at the moment. So that's really, you know, use it or lose it is probably our biggest thing that we think can drive real social change through families and through employer groups over time.
And if I could just add one comment to that, I think the untapped potential here in having more men step away from care is the way in which we can use those gaps to bring women and talented women who are sitting in the pipeline into those roles. So they may not have access, say, to a job share situation in a profit and loss or in a higher sort of level role. So when men go on parental leave and vacate their role in however they choose to do it, probably ideally on a part-time basis, there is such an enormous potential to bring women into those roles, to mentor them, to give them a really good go at that higher level, and therefore gain the experience that we've long been trying to give women, and say that's one of the reasons why they're not stepping into those leadership and clout positions. So it actually solves a number of problems.
We had evidence earlier this morning that even where these entitlements exist within our industrial framework, that women, particularly in lower paid industries, may feel concerned to take up the entitlements available to them for fear of repercussion from their employers or being unfairly punished for doing so in their workplace. Just wondering if either witnesses had a perspective on how our system is currently protecting those workers, and if there's any impediments you see in the actual take-up of the provisions which are provided for in this legislation.
I think I might defer to Wajir on this one. Unfortunately, the nature of our workforce isn't probably that relevant.
Thanks, Ms. Kitchen.
I guess the main comment that I'd like to make on that is that level of discrimination, or that sense that there'll be some kind of latent penalty for taking leave, whether it's obvious or not, is extended right through the workforce and has been there from the very beginning. What we've seen is that's traditionally been pitched at women, but we do know from emerging evidence that is also pitched at men who participate in primary care of children. I guess what we're dealing with there is this notion of what we call an ideal worker norm, that they are full-time, always present, and by extension then they are men, because men have been able to fall into that role a lot more easily. So I think at the different levels of the organisation, however, it's interesting that we talk about women in lower levels because they have less power. And so that in and of itself is an important thing to consider. In terms of the protection, there are protections out there, and there is a number of legal protections and legal recourses that are open to anyone who feels that they are discriminated against on the grounds of pregnancy, sex, any of those things, so those protected attributes. I think one of the biggest problems is how do we deal with the backlash, so that is latent, so that is something that requires cultural change. And I think the other part of that is also making sure that people know what protections are available to them and the various ways that they might be able to go about that. We see that happen in the sexual harassment space all the time, and this is no different. So I think there's there's two things that we need to do. We need to sort of up the education and understanding of what good looks like in this space and the benefits that are available, but also give both employers and employees a better understanding of the legalities, what their entitlements are, and of course how they can benefit from having something like a paid parental leave scheme.
Mm. Thank you. Yes.
Added to that, as I tend to want to do, given that our data set. For WGEA reporting employers, of the primary paid parental leave taken, overall it's 13% of primary carers' leave is taken by men and 87% by women. Interestingly though, for managers, 24% of managerial paid parental leave is men versus 76%. And for non-managers, it's 12% is taken by men and 88% women. So just, it doesn't go to your point in terms of the low-paid women, but it does go to the point that the shifts are occurring at the managerial level. Now, we see that as a positive because the managers demonstrating that behaviour then helps to translate and change the culture and create an environment where taking parental leave and those sort of shifts can occur. But there still is, some very set stereotypes or the shift in stereotypes are changing more slowly for the non-managerial workforce, and that's something obviously that needs to continue to be worked on.
Thank you. And look, I know you both support the legislation and the steps it takes to expand the paid parental leave scheme. Probably one for you, Ms. Kitchen, beyond the sort of specific questions around potential for policy expansion, including to use it or lose it, do you have any technical concerns with the way the legislation is drafted?
No, we don't.
Okay. And is that the same for the Workplace Gender Equality Agency?
So we support the approach that's been taken.
Great. Thank you. It's always useful in these hearings to just check the technicalities of the drafting. Thank you very much. I'll just go to Senator Waters, who's got a couple of follow-up questions.
Thanks very much, Chair. Thanks both again. Can I just harken back to this notion of how currently we've got a mix of government-funded and employer-funded PPL, and whilst there might be a variety of views, such as one the ACTU has proposed for all of the bells and whistles for all workers, how do you think we should balance that division of employer-funded versus government-funded? What do you think is the best model for promoting gender equality? And what are any constraints to that best model being a reality?
Do Wajir want to go first on that? I mean, from my perspective, we see, and I guess I speak as chair of Women's Task Force Committee at BCA, as well as from KPMG's own experience. I think most of our members who have got generous paid parental leave schemes do it as a differentiator, as part of being able to attract and retain talent in the way that I described. And therefore, in a way, whilst it would save some money, if you made it universally available, then we'd have to think of some different way to make ourselves a more attractive employer than others. So I think, you know, in our minds, it's clear that there is a size of employer where it's very disruptive to the workforce to take someone out. We have 10,000 employees. If we have, you know, people on paid parental leave, we can manage their roles, understand for small employers. So in our minds and the experience certainly of other BCA members, we see very much clear that there needs to be a safety net for businesses that can't afford it. And I would imagine that was predominantly small employers, and that's really underpinned our thinking.
And I just have a clarification there. So is it your view that the workers that are in those small businesses would only get the government funded scheme, or is your vision that all workers would have an entitlement to, let's say, 52 weeks of paid, but that if you were in a large organisation, the employer would pay the full quantity, and if you were in a smaller, if you were a smaller employee, then you would only pay, say, you know, the government would pay up to the minimum wage and you'd pay the top up, or vice versa. Is it the case that you think workers should have the same entitlement no matter the size of their employer, but then who pays would differ? Or
no, I think there's a massive fiscal constraint in that, isn't there, that really you have to leave to government to what they can afford. But I think what we were advocating for is that there should be a minimum access for all women, and then employers who are able to and willing to supplement that either by paying a higher wage or by making it more generous, are able to do that as a matter of part of their terms of employment conditions.
did Wajir have a view on that division of who should pay and to what amount?
I think that would probably come into the policy proposal. So we probably should defer to Alison's comments in relation to that.
That's fine.
The only other thing I would add, which I think a small number of employers are doing, which is just an interesting another angle, is that some employers, and we are certainly advocating to employers, that the potential is that they may choose to not pay full parental leave, but if they have financial constraints, that they may pay a top-up between the government scheme and replacement wages, for example. And so there's ways that employers can choose to enhance, you know, a minimum scheme to achieve some of those differentiators that Alison's been talking about.
Thank you. And just one last question. The AI group and various other business representative bodies have raised some concern that the increased flexibility in how PPL can be taken, if this new draft law was to pass, for example, taking it in shorter blocks over the 2-year period, they've raised concerns that this would be a burden on some employers, particularly smaller ones. First of all, do you think that's an overstated concern? Or do you think it's a valid one? And if you think it's valid, are there any measures that you think could be proposed to address those concerns, but without limiting the flexibility that the bill proposes?
I'm not sure that I'm very well placed to comment in relation to small business. I mean, I can see that it would be it's harder to balance when you don't have that capacity. You may wish to say you have to have some notice periods or something in order to give people flexibility, rather than just working on it on a minute by minute basis so that people have time to plan around it.
And from a women's perspective, as we mentioned before, the ability to, and women and family and men's perspective, the ability to use that flexibly is a critical component to effective transition back to work, reflecting the diversity of caring environments that people experience. So we continue to be very supportive from a gender equality perspective of maximising the flexibility, recognising that it can be challenging for employers, but it's one that's an investment that often results in greater retention and productivity on return that has benefits that pay off in different ways.
All right, thank you very much for your time and your expertise. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Senator Brockman, I'll just check that you didn't have any supplementary questions.
No, it's all good from me, Chair.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for appearing and for your evidence today. We very much appreciate you taking the time to be part of the committee's work. We will be taking a short suspension now for the lunch break, and we'll be returning at 1:10 p.m. Canberra time, which is 12:40 Adelaide time. See you soon. I would like to welcome Dr. Leonora Rees and representatives from Parents at Work and the Advancing Parental Leave Equality Network, the Parenthood, the Northern Territory Working Women's Centre and the Diversity Council of Australia. Thank you all for taking the time to appear before us today and for supporting our work with your evidence. For the Hansard record, we're going to go around in a circle and I'll just ask you to state your full names, please, and the capacity in which you're hearing today. This assists with the Hansard record being taken. So perhaps let's start with Dr. Rees, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. You got Dr. Rees online? Oh, okay. Parents at Work.
Hello, yes, it's Emma Walsh. I'm the CEO of Parents at Work.
Excellent. I can see Georgie, but can you state your name, Georgie?
Yes, hi, it's Georgie Dent. I'm the CEO of the Parenthood.
And the Northern Territory Working Women's Centre? No one from there yet? No, okay. And the Diversity Council of Australia?
Thank you. Lisa Anise, CEO, Diversity Council Australia.
And who have I missed? Oh,
Catherine Brown, I'm the Director of Communications at Advocacy.
Sorry, Kathy.
No, that's okay.
Excellent. Have I missed anyone?
Sorry, yes. So I'm Sarah Jane Hunt. I'm an Industrial Liaison Officer at Northern Territory Working Women's.
Hi, we're just having some challenges with our sound. Can someone say something to see if I've picked that up now? Please.
Hi, yes, you're here and we're underway.
I can't hear anyone.
Tita, we might get you to give the call.
We will continue. Sorry, apologies. It's just been one of these mornings with this computer. We'll give it another whirl. Thank you.
Apologies, Ms. Hunt. Would you be able to just say your title and your organisation again?
Yes, Industrial Liaison Officer at Northern Territory Working Women's Centre, and I believe that was just Nikki, our Director as well, who's having some technical issues.
Okay, hopefully we can resolve them soon.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I think we have Dr. Is it Rees or Rice?
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Yes, Dr. Leonora Rees. My apologies, I was missing audio before, but I've got you now. Great to join you. Thank you.
That's okay. These hearings are excellent in that we can all participate from home in our various states, but they do require a little bit of patience as we navigate taking evidence in this way. We normally at this point would go to opening statements for each witness, but because of the number of witnesses we have on this panel, and I'm sure there's quite a lot of questions from senators, are witnesses happy to either table those statements or sort of deal with what they would have in those statements in the course of questioning? Everyone, lots of nods. Excellent. Thank you very much. All right, I am going to kick off with Senator Pocock. Senator, are you there?
Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to have you here with all of your evidence. I wonder if I can start off with a question. I imagine that there is general support for an increase in the period of paid parental leave. And I just wanted to start with a question about whether that's a big enough increase and what your view is of evidence we've heard this morning about a larger increase through to 52 weeks by 2030, for example, as we heard from the ACTU. So that was a start-off question, but related to that, I'm also eager to hear your views about the level of income that's appropriate for our paid parental leave scheme. So can I just start with those two issues, which I think are really important as we consider this proposed change.
Now, everyone will be very polite, so why don't you raise your hand and I'll try and manage the call. If you raise your hand if you've got a contribution to make, and I'll come to you. Thanks, Ms Dent.
Thank you, Senator Pocock, for the question, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute today to this inquiry. So the Parenthood is an independent national advocacy organisation that represents parents and carers. Our mission is to make Australia the best place in the world to be a parent, because it is only when parents and caregivers are supported that children can thrive. And we know that that is never more fundamental and critical than in the early years. The Parenthood's position is that Australia should ultimately adopt a world-leading paid parental leave scheme. Our research and evidence is that a world-leading scheme would offer 52 weeks at a replacement wage rate, including super, that is shared between parents where there are two parents. Now, we know that at the moment, the average length of paid leave that parents have access to in the OECD is more than 52 weeks. So we have to consider the context in which we are operating. Australia really does lag the developed world in the provision of paid parental leave. Our position equally is that a world-leading scheme is paid at a replacement wage rate, because that reflects, it encourages men in particular to take up parental leave when it is paid at a higher than minimum wage rate, but also because paid parental leave is ultimately about recognising that taking time out of the paid workforce to look after children is something that is completely valid and part of the normal course of life, and that is our position.
Right, thank you. Very clear.
Helps if I unmute myself. Ms Ines.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Senator, for your question. And thanks, Georgie, for your comments. Look, DCA, and we're an employer-based organisation, our members represent over 20% of the labour market. So it's not insignificant, and we've been in a dialogue with them about these matters for many years now. Our view is, notwithstanding Australia's position within the OECD, well below the average of 53 weeks, the recommendations from the World Health Organization around breastfeeding, obviously a minimum of 6 months to establish breastfeeding. But what we also know is that this is part of a broader conversation around the impact of gender equality and the impact that that might have on the economy. And we know that to increase Australia's productivity, that women's economic participation is the unlocked key in that. So DCA is very much in favour of, we don't have a view as to exactly the amount, although we would say that a minimum of 26 weeks would be appropriate, but we're really comfortable with anything beyond that. And what we do think is that the Gender Equality Economic Task Force that's being headed up by Sam Mostyn, this would be a really interesting question for them to do some analysis and report back on. We also are of the view that superannuation absolutely must be paid on parental leave, and that without doing that, we really are contributing to the lifetime earnings deficit that women carry due to their caring responsibilities. We also know that we need to do whatever it is that we can to support men in taking up parental leave for various reasons. Obviously, we know that this will contribute to the well-being of the family unit. We know that it will contribute to the well-being of children to have that shared care model of parental leave operating in their home. But we also know this is really good for men, and there's plenty of research that supports that. So we believe a more generous scheme and one which has entrenched within that use it or lose it provisions, possibly with a bonus, which is something that we recommended in our submission, will go a long way in encouraging men to fully participate in this early stage of their child's life. And that will also support women in their workplace participation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, Ms. Walsh. Oh, and now you're doing it, Ms. Walsh. So.
Unmute. Thank you so much to the committee for having me here today, and thank you, Senator, for the question. I too concur with what Georgie and Lisa have just shared. The parental leave scheme that we have at the moment just lags the world. We know that the increase that we have in mind will help. That's great to get it to 26 weeks, but we would believe that that doesn't go far enough, quickly enough. As Lisa has said, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that a well-funded paid parental leave scheme does, in fact, improve gender equality. And we know that in order for that to be possible, we need men's ability to share the leave to be easier than it currently is. But we also think that at the moment, most of Australia's progression around paid parental leave has been driven by employers. And so now we have a number of schemes that are very generous, and obviously some who work in workplaces that offer none at all. And so what that's doing is really, in fact, creating a greater inequity and divide, with many just reliant on the government's minimum wage if they can get access to it. So we too believe there needs to be a replacement wage looked at. And we would like to see 52 weeks by 2030 as well. We know that it works because we too work with workplaces. So we have over 150 workplaces that we service, and we provide advice and education to them around how to advance family-friendly workplace policies to embed more family-friendly ways of working. And of the organisations that we work with, some have implemented up to 26 weeks at full pay for both genders, and it's working. The organisations are reporting a rise of 200 to 300% in the number of dads taking parental leave. And these organisations have said that it's become an important lever in their inclusion and diversity commitment, and helps them to attract and retain its current workforce. But they don't think it's just the right thing to do. They can see the clear economic business case for doing so. But one of the things that they've said around why it works is that it's close to a replacement wage, but they work in a culture that encourages men to use it. And I think we need to be engaging workplaces more to see the importance of investing in family-friendly workplace practices. So how can we get government further investing and engaging the business community to educate and incentivise employers to adopt more of these policies is something we'd like to see as well.
Hi, is it okay for me to speak?
Yes.
Hi, okay, great, thank you. I'd also like to just clarify, I'm speaking here in my independent capacity as an academic economist. In terms of the length, I think there's very strong evidence that at least 26 weeks is required as a minimum. We have the recommendation from the World Health Organization, but we have substantial evidence on top of that as to the benefits for extending the amount of leave. But I would like to highlight that in addition to talking about what should be the length and what should be the level, the third component, the third criteria or decision-making point here has to be the allocation between the two parents. If we're only talking about length and we don't have a system set up where there are incentives and enforcements even for fathers to take a specific allocation of leave, we could very well see women taking up to 52 weeks of leave, which would be detrimental to women's progress in the wider economy in terms of deteriorating their attachment and widening gaps between men and women's economic outcomes. So I would like to highlight that that third mechanism needs to be part of this collective conversation. We can look at extending beyond 26 weeks, and the other panelists here have made the very good point that for as long as it's at minimum wage, there's going to be limited incentive for fathers or men or for the higher income earner of a household to take that leave. So we do have to look at setting up that incentive structure. But I think what we're seeing internationally in terms of best models is specifying quite dedicated leave allocations for mothers or birth givers as a way of recognising the importance of maternal recovery from childbirth, establishing breastfeeding, and establishing healthy patterns for care and child development. And alongside, we're seeing that evidence emerge of the critical importance to allocate a specific portion for fathers or partners and not just leave it up to families to figure it out for themselves, because that socially legitimizes men as caregivers. And at the moment, this 2 weeks each is really, in my view, quite insufficient for articulating the importance of those goals, which are part of a publicly provided parental leave scheme. This is the government articulating, we support and acknowledge the importance of maternal recovery. We acknowledge and endorse fathers participating in care. And then you have the remaining portion. And what we're seeing internationally, it's around about 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 that's sort of emerging as best practice. So alongside these developments or these conversations about extending the length, we want to make sure that we're not inadvertently impinging on women's progress in terms of wider gender equality goals, and that we keep in mind that we're not designing a corporate strategy, we're designing what's in the national interest. So we have a lot of great examples of what works for retention and recruitment from the perspective of employers. That's really informative, but we also need to keep in mind what are the design elements that would be positive for our country as a whole. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Hi, is that me now? I assume so.
Yes.
Hello. So a lot of great points have already been made, so we won't go into great detail about that, but just very briefly summarise our position. So for those who may not know, the Northern Territory Working Women's Centre provides advice, advocacy, support, referral and community education to working women in Northern Territory. We are one of 3 working women's centres in Australia, which includes Queensland and SA, and we work very closely with working women's centres. And when we were going through this, I note that we made a collective submission in 2008 in relation to the Productivity Commission's inquiry into a paid parental scheme. So it's really interesting when I refer back to that, it's still very relevant today in terms of what we've asked. While there's been some progress, we still haven't got quite far enough. And a lot of what we support remains very much in that submission. I don't know if you've received that, but I have certainly forwarded that on this morning. I think the proposed changes, but I think it can potentially be a game changer for families and women in the workforce, but it hasn't gone far enough. And I think what we need to look at is where it hasn't. I'll deal with those in a moment, but basically our paper focused on expanding the provision of paid parental leave to workers that are currently not covered, like for example, on particular working visas. Given you're here for a number of years, you contribute to the economy and the workforce, but somehow we just don't provide for this. So this is where I think it's lacking, because it creates a disparity in the workforce and entitlements. We think it doesn't address adequately vulnerabilities around domestic and family violence, particularly around the concept of permissions and how that's going to be managed in practice, and what provisions might need to be made in the event that that permission wasn't provided voluntarily. And we have examples that I could cite in relation to some of that. We also want to make sure that women who are working in a very casual type environment have got support when they need it. Where I think the bill can expand to provide more in terms of for families, I mean, the intention is to address gender inequality, but also for families, to improve families' situations, is to expand to a minimum of at least 26 weeks. So we very much support that as a minimum paid leave, with the idea of it can be considered longer down the track. The other thing is we think the preserved component where both parties can use it or lose it is 2 weeks. We think women should have a minimum of 6 weeks, given the impacts it's going to have on their health, at least, and well-being, and adjustments that are necessary in caring for a child. So I think that should already be an automatic 6 weeks for women. And I acknowledge that there's that balance between not impinging on a woman's rights and family's rights to choose, but also recognising the particular role women play in relation to birth and what that means for them and their health and well-being. We think also, so in terms of the domestic and family violence, what can be considered in terms of if there's an ability to revoke that permission, is there an ability to restore the entitlements where they may have not been provided voluntarily. We believe in super being paid on the payment, but not on minimum wage. And for the reasons already described today, it's got to be an incentive. It's not, families shouldn't have to be making a financial decision whether they can care for the child, because minimum wage is not actually a suitable, it's not an income replacement. And so that could, and particularly when we're watching at the moment, the cost of living rising, issues regarding more people under mortgage stress, it's really not going to be an adequate solution. So we think it needs to be reflective of that person's income. There was an interesting point made, not today, but previously, I just recall about the need to, why we have the residency and the working requirements that are and I question about if one parent's entitled, say the father in this scenario, why it couldn't automatically flow onto the mother, because you're really not giving people choices about that, where the woman may not satisfy the residency test, for example. And also about this requirement that women have to earn their 12 months of work to be able to obtain this paid parental leave, when there's other leave entitlements that we actually don't have to do an entire 12 months to avail of, such as sick leave and annual leave that's accrued. So I think for us, it's just thinking more broadly around ways that we can, if we're really true about the intention of the Act, which is to improve families' situations and options and decision making, you need to be, and also to increase women's workforce participation and financial security, you need to be able to consider these in light of the bill moving forward. I think that's all for me for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Pocock, I might come to you for one more question, and then I just need to move the call around.
Thank you. Look, what I hear, Chair, and everyone online, is a lot of commonality and agreement, and we have a very diverse group of witnesses in this session, clearly people who represent the perspective of employers, of parents and children, but also Working Women's Centre and academics. And I think I'm hearing a lot of strong support for finding a pathway to a longer period of leave. I'm hearing a lot of support for an increase in the income available, a lot of support for the sharing of care between parents. And so my last two questions really, or the issues I'd like to hear people again on, are firstly the question of eligibility, which the Northern Territory Women's Centre, Working Women's Centre have spoken of. We heard evidence this morning of quite a lot of interest in making this more broadly available. The people who miss out are very often on very variable incomes at the bottom end of the income scale. So if anyone has anything further or wants to disagree with that, I think there's quite an interesting issue about eligibility to pursue. And then the question of how do we get to income replacement. Are there views out there? We heard one view this morning for a shift from minimum wage to 60% of the median wage, which is some dollars higher. But also, is there any interest or any comment on whether employers could top up above a minimum wage or 60% of income replacement? If there's any comments on that, I would welcome those.
Yes, Ms. Ines.
Yeah, I'm really happy to talk about it. As we know, like a lot of employers do top up. They have really generous parental leave schemes, but these tend to be employers, they tend to be big employers, lots of them are multinationals or big ASX listed organisations. And so we know there's a problem with coverage. So your ability to access great support when you have a baby depends on who you're working for, which exacerbates inequality across the economy. So while I think that it's a really good thing that employers should top up where they can afford it, we know that that's unlikely, especially with small business. And so therefore we're increasing the income disparity. And we know that your social class will really predict the kind of start your children can have in life. So we really feel that there's a strong role here for government to increase its generosity around the payment, that this is a social good. This is an investment into families across the economy, and an investment into children and to parents, no matter where you work, what kind of employment you have and how that is structured. Because what we don't want to see is have a system that is really skewed towards benefiting people who already have higher incomes and so therefore in a better position. What I will say for employers, and we work with them all the time, lots of them understand that the business case for parental leave is really clear. The business case for shared care parental leave, which is something that I know Emma Walsh sort of lives and breathes, is really clear. You have more engaged, more innovative and more productive employees at work when they feel as though they're working in an inclusive environment. And we measure that empirically every 2 years. And a lot of employers have now clued into this. And so they see this as an investment into their employees that will give them a return through loyalty, through innovation, through productivity. Unfortunately, a lot of employers are not there yet. Our members represent 20% of the labour market, so there's still a lot of people in the labour market for whom the business case around creating these inclusive work practices and supporting work and family is not evident to them, and so it's seen as a burden rather than an investment. And so for those reasons, I think that we need to be really careful. We should encourage employers, but we can't take away from the social responsibility that government needs to play a really important role in this.
Yes, Ms. Walsh.
Yes, I just wanted to concur with Lisa. How can we reframe this conversation so it's seen more as an investment, not a cost? So much of the barrier seems to be, whether it's talking to employers or government on this in the past, has been, yes, sounds good, but how much is it going to cost? And so that strikes me that the government needs to do more, in particular, for itself, but also for the business community to make that argument much clearer, because all the evidence is there. And so for some reason, what's the barrier? What's the gap? And really understanding what's holding us back from implementing a more generous scheme, because we know it will return in buckets. On the employer front, because that's obviously where I do a lot of my advocacy work and leadership work around encouraging organisations to remove labels and to top up. And I too represent a small business. I have a small team of 12 in our company, and we've introduced 26 weeks paid leave. But I do understand the difficulty that employers have, and concern that particularly in a small business, how it's not so much the payment itself, I feel, that might be a concern for employers, as certainly in a top-up arrangement, but more the replacement. If they have to find money to actually hire a new person to fill that gap while the person's on parental leave, that's an additional cost. So how can the government look at some sort of incentive, tax rebate, whatever it might be, that's going to help smaller businesses cover that cost of additional hires? I don't have the answer, but I think they're questions that we need to explore that haven't been explored as far as I can tell at this point. So, really urging us to think a little more creatively, perhaps, and more deeply around how we engage both government and business to come to the party. And I'd just like to add that I agree, I don't think businesses can be responsible for filling the shortfall around Australia's lack of investment in paid parental leave, but they can certainly be part of the solution, because we know that if men in particular are not engaged as caregivers, because culturally they work in a workplace that says, well, men don't do that around here, then it doesn't matter how much we pay, they're not going to take it. So we really do need to address the systemic barriers in workplaces around men and caregiving. And we need to invest in that more than we have, I think, and have much more collective effort around it.
Thank you, Ms. Walsh. I'm just conscious of time. I've got another of other questions. So I might take some questions, Senator Pocock. Senator Waters has some as well. And then if we have time, I'll circle back to you, because I'm sure you have more as well. I just wanted to ask some specific questions of witnesses. My first is to Dr. Rees. You mentioned briefly earlier in your evidence, you referred to the economic impact of the changes in this bill, and in particular the expansion to 26 weeks, which is a measure within this bill, albeit before July 2024. Can you just talk to us a bit further about the provisions within this bill and what economic impact you do think they will have?
Thank you, Senator. So yes, I was working under the assumption that we're looking simply at this stage of increasing to 26 weeks over time. One point I'd like to raise is that this notion of this staggered approach, increasing 2 weeks at a time, I assume that has been proposed under the assumption that we have budgetary considerations. We're operating under a structural budget deficit, and this might be a way of mitigating those cost impositions. I would draw the committee's attention to potential risk with that approach. There has been research undertaken actually by now parliamentarian Dr. Andrew Leigh into what were the effects of the staggered introduction of the baby bonus over time, and they actually found that there were some behavioural impacts on people in terms of the timing of their pregnancies. It was quite disruptive for hospitals. So I think just in terms of what's proposed under this bill with that staggered approach, that's something to be mindful of, that there could actually be some destabilising effects by mapping it out over time, as opposed to doing it in one discrete move. It also, I think, would make it clearer to the workforce and to employees what is the government doing, as opposed to what are employers doing, if the government activates that move to 26 weeks in one go. In terms of the economic benefits, what we have seen from evidence from Quebec is that it was the provision of the use it or lose it component for fathers at 70 to 75% replacement wage that activated a higher full-time labour force participation rate amongst women. So that was the key economic outcome of that shift in the policy design. So it was contributing towards closing that gap in observed economic outcomes between men and women in the paid workforce. And it was obviously then also narrowing this time use gap between mothers and fathers or parents in the household in terms of unpaid care. Where there's great potential for us to see further change is by shifting that norm that men currently, there's a stigma involved with men associating themselves with care. And so by shifting that norm and that behaviour very early on, it's beneficial for women in that it is opening up their opportunity to be more involved in the paid workforce, but it is also legitimising and opening up more opportunities for men to be involved at home. And that has economic benefits as well, and social benefits as well. It contributes to family stability, and it also legitimises men stepping into the realm of care, not necessarily just at home, but in the paid workforce as well. So young children grow up seeing their fathers involved in care. And so it normalises males, as caregivers. And in the future, we desperately need more workers in the paid care workforce. And so by shifting those norms very early on, we have those ripple effects ahead of us. And the evidence from the Nordic countries is that's what happened, that children who observed their parents participating in a more balanced way in terms of household chores and caregiving, they grew up with less traditional attitudes about gender roles in society. So you have these potential generational effects that free up men, women, individuals of all genders to then step into vocations and household roles that are not constricted by gender norms. And we desperately need that for a more healthy and dynamic economy.
Thank you very much. Did I have a question as well for the Northern Territory Working Women's Centre? Your submission makes reference to family disputes and family and domestic violence and the impact of these measures on that. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to unpack those issues a bit further for us.
Thank you. I will. I've also, I think, have Sarah from our office on the line, so I might throw some questions to her, some comments or opportunity to comment. So basically what we're looking at is where there's already, in the context of a domestic violence situation or where there's coercion and control, a controlling relationship, and how that might play out in family law disputes where, so what the courts have not seen before is where, and we're not, the Working Women's Centre are not family law experts, but we can only talk about what we've seen in relation to our clients' experience and how this might, so we're flagging this as a potential consideration. So one of the things is how this money might be deemed. Like previously, it's always been some payment to a woman, really, the birth mother, and it's never been an issue. But where there's a shared, it's the allocation that was discussed previously, how to work out who gets what, and where, for example, it could be used as leverage where a abusive partner, whether real or otherwise, it could still be used where the parent says, one of the parents says, not the birth parent, that if you don't agree to this, then I will seek this payment. So, and that way the mother doesn't get the opportunity to bond and care and for her child as was intended. So I think it's just about in family court where there's already deviant, hostile dynamics, how this might play out. And I think while it may be negligible, we don't know. And like we said, it's how the partner in this relationship that's already been controlled, how that might be used against them. Sarah's on the line. Sarah, do you want to add anything further in relation to that?
Yes, I think you've summed it up well, Nikki, but I might just elaborate a little bit further. Sorry, my camera's also not working, so I'll just speak without being seen. I apologise for that. In relation to this context, I guess our main concern is that it's going to exacerbate existing issues that already exist. So a lot of the time, DV and family law issues or family dispute issues are very closely intertwined. You see one arising with the other very commonly. And in these contexts, I suppose our view would be to provide as much support and as much clarity on how it would be established to be separated or the entitlement shared in certain contexts to minimise that risk of being leveraged or used in you know, a coercive control or a financially abusing manner. Yeah, that would be the main concern. We do see a lot of clients that feel like they don't have a lot of financial autonomy, feel like they can't go back to work because their partner won't allow them, or, you know, how that plays out in certain dynamics is quite impactful, and it really limits, I suppose, from our perspective, women's opportunities in terms of caregiving and employment opportunity. So yeah, our recommendation or our view would be to have some sort of structure on how that could be supportive to minimise that risk and that impact. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. And just my final question I'll put out to all witnesses. So understanding that there's some interest in sort of future expansions of paid parental leave and what we can do to support women and their families. But my understanding is that you're all supportive of what we have in the bill as well. Can I just give you an opportunity? Is there anything in the bill as it's drafted that you're concerned about that we haven't already discussed today? And I'm not talking here about sort of opportunities to do more, but just is there anything in terms of the way the legislation is drafted that you wanted to draw our attention to? Yes, Dr. Lees.
Thank you. Just quickly, I would say I noticed there was no provision made for an independent evaluation and review of the bill, as was included in the original paid parental leave legislation, particularly given that it's somewhat iterative and you're, I guess, gauging what is going to be the impact. I think that would be essential to include that in this bill.
Thank you. And did anyone else have any concerns in the way the bill is drafted as it stands that they haven't spoken to? Yes, Ms. Petro.
I think for us, just to be clearer on some of the terms and how that might affect parties in this situation, I think also around the just the eligibility, again, making that available for where one party is automatically entitled, like, for example, the family income, the pooled together family income. We think that perhaps that should also apply more broadly than where the birth parent may not be entitled. It's just expanding on what I said earlier, to enable the birth parent to want to take care of the child. And if one parent's eligible, then it should apply. But what we seem to see at the moment is that it appears that the eligibility is more around the father gains it, even though the mother may not get it because he's entitled, but it doesn't seem to work in reverse for mothers who would not otherwise be entitled, but fathers are, to gain that benefit, if that makes sense. So I think for us, we want to be able to, if we're talking about making it available to families to make decisions together about what's in the best interest of their child, financial considerations, women's workforce participation, then we need to be able to expand it to include women who otherwise would not be eligible, but their partners are.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm just going to check. Senator Brockman, do you still not have further questions, or?
I'm good, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Senator Waters, your turn.
Thanks very much, Chair. And thanks so much to all the witnesses, not just for your time today, but for your incredible advocacy that you've done in this space, in the media and in public. I really do feel like the public debate is shifting, particularly in relation to men doing more care and domestic duties for that matter. So kudos to all of you for that shared project that we all aspire to see succeed in future. A lot of the issues that I wanted to ask you about have been really beautifully covered, but there's two things that I just like a bit more clarity on, and I'm keen for everybody's input who has a view. Firstly, what is, in your view, world's best practice or optimal model for who would pay? The ACTU was proposing the 52-week with super, with shared care at replacement wage by 2030. They're all features that sound really great, but do you have a view on whether there should be a base level that's provided by employers, topped up by government, or vice versa? Or is it your opinion that this should be a fully funded government scheme as the ACTU is envisaging? What's the best split? And until we get to that utopia, how do the schemes that are both employer funded and government funded, how should they mesh together? in a way that improves gender equality and incentivises birth parents back into the workforce.
Sorry, Georgie.
Thank you, and thank you, Senator. I won't take long here because I'm sure the others have got answers as well. But like the ACTU, the Parenthood's position is that ultimately best practice would be a fully funded government scheme that is paid at a replacement wage rate, 52 weeks with super shared. And our view around the funding of it is, and it is interesting, I have to reflect on the fact that I was in Canberra last week and attended the Early Years Summit, which was convened to really help inform the early years strategy. And what that forum was really focused on is what are the ways in which we can ensure that parents and their children have got access to the resources, support and services they need in those crucial early years. And I would include the pre and antenatal period in that, because we know that supporting the health and well-being of parents is so inextricably linked with the health and well-being of particularly when we're talking about infants and babies, but also children. And it really goes to the sort of universality. So the reason why paid parental leave is so beneficial from a health perspective, from a social perspective, from an economic perspective, is it's not about the individual workplace where you are or how much money you make. It's the fact that you've given birth and you've brought a little person into the world, and you are now going to be responsible for nurturing and caring and raising that little person. And, you know, that's the reason why we need paid parental leave at all, because we need parents to be able to take on that task without the additional pressure and stress of not having any income or, you know, not having any sort of level of financial support during that period. And as has been raised, there's no doubt that a lot of the really positive progress that's happened in the last few years around paid parental leave has been in employers, and it particularly has been pronounced around employers encouraging men to take extended leave as the norm. And while that is fantastic, as has been said, it does lead to a potential sort of widening of inequity, because we know that the larger employers that do have these fantastic policies that they are actively encouraging their employees, both men and women, to take, tend to be larger companies. They tend to be you know, full-time employment where you've got the benefits of annual leave, of sick leave. You know, you're already in a much more advantaged, secure position. And so our view around government funding is because the benefits need to attach to the sort of the parent and the child, not via the workplace.
Yes, Ms. Walsh.
I would agree with Georgie, and we share a very similar position. I think I would just add an "and" to it, where, you know, I think we would all feel the term "it takes a village to raise a child," and I have a strong belief that employers need to be part of that. Now, I think it's far more important, rather than asking the question of who pays, because we've just had that conversation of investment versus cost, it's how do we educate workplaces around normalising parental leave as a part of in many employees' lives. Caring is part of many employees' lives. Men and women probably need to take it at some point in their lifetime, whether it's parental leave or other forms of caring kind of leave. And we haven't got that normalised. So I think we need to be thinking about what we can do to engage employers in the importance of creating a culture where it's normal for men and women to share parental leave. And that's where the focus needs to be, around engaging workplaces on it as a starting point, because if they can see the benefits and they can be educated around how to get involved and support, then that's going to go a long way. I mentioned before that if we have a really generous paid parental leave scheme, sorted and paid for entirely by government, but we have workplaces that don't normalise it, that it's okay for men to actually use that leave, in particular men, or women for that matter, then we're not going to necessarily have people engage in it as much as we would hope. So I think we have to find a way to engage employers better. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Anise.
Thank you. Look, there are many things employers need to do, and some of the more advanced ones are already starting to do it, and Emma's just laid that out. Employers certainly need to be able to know how to navigate and have structure employment relationships with staff that are agile and flexible, because there's, in the legislation, the opportunity for that parental leave to be taken in a flexible and agile way, which is really, really helpful. The more choice and options you give families, the better their well-being and the more productive they can be in the workplace. So there is a role for employers, absolutely. And the more employers get on board with this, that is a positive and a good thing for the economy. But when it comes to payment, because there's a lot at stake, because if we do it any other way, will lead to a two-tiered system like what we see in the childcare system now. Because if we do it in a way that we're leaning heavily on employers, it will always be people employed by consciously minded and well-resourced employers and their families that will benefit. And what we know is that the having and raising of children benefits the whole community and the whole society, and so there's a social responsibility there. So we're firmly in the view that government has a big role here.
Yes, back to you, Dr. Rees.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, so I'll be quick with this. So as an economist, we would say there's definitely a social benefit and there's a market failure. So we can't simply rely on private companies to deliver an equitable and efficient scheme. In my research, which I think Senator Waters may have mentioned earlier in the hearings, when we look at which firms do provide their own parental leave systems, it's more so the larger firms that have the HR departments and the capacity to backbill. So I think I remember reading Senator Pocock's earlier work on this, that, if you leave it up to the market, it's basically like a lucky dip. It's not fair at all. So there's a very strong rationale for government enrolment to set that foundational platform as the expectations and the standards that we aspire for every person in our country that's not dependent on their employer. But I think in terms of who pays for it, right, this is the big elephant in the room as well. So we can calculate the GDP payoffs in the future. That's not going to be till the medium or long term. I think what's really progressive is that in the Treasury's budget calculations, that they aren't just interpreting this as an outlay and a cost. They are doing the sums to figure out what is going to be the implication for participation rates and therefore for tax revenue. And I'd like to encourage the committee here to support Treasury's resourcing and funding to continue to invest in those types of calibrations, because they're really important for recognising this isn't just one side of the budget ledger. This has the benefits that come through, obviously, that go beyond GDP and that expand to wellbeing as well. What might be of interest to the committee is that the Quebec model that offers replacement rates, and that's where we saw the uptake in men's usage. They operate according to, it's like an insurance plan. So they impose a levy with employer and employee contributions. So that goes into this funding pool, which then funds this this leave allowance. And then if we look to our Nordic countries, we know that they're characterised by very high tax to GDP ratios. So it is about identifying where do you either reallocate your current public funding, or where do you make provisions for some sort of tax stream that's allocated to this in recognition that it does have wider social benefits. So I think that's a broader conversation, right, for government to have, but I don't think we can propose a model without also being mindful that there are collective benefits, and therefore you could make a case that there's a reason for it to be taxpayer funded, public funded, as well as to incentivise and ensure that employers also contribute. The benefits for employers are in terms of recruitment and retention for their own workforce, and we see that they often offer these leave policies in settings where they invest a lot in their own workers. workers that are quite mobile, like in accommodation, hospitality, they move around a lot. They're less likely to be offered leave policies because there's less incentive for employers to hold on to them. But you could also make the case that for employers, this is beneficial because it broadens their potential pool of labour. It's an investment in human capital, right? So there's benefits that justify employer contributions above and beyond, you know, what they might do of their own accord.
All right, we probably have time for one more question.
All right, thank you. That was a really fascinating response from all of you. I didn't hear from Nikki Petru, but perhaps you can chime in on the next question. And yeah, thanks for your expertise. This is really, really important policy work. Just coming back to the shared care proportion, there was this, I think it was Ms. Petru that was saying that her view was there should be a minimum 6-week birth parent only, just for medical recovery and other reasons. But can I get a view, please, on what would be best practice in terms of the allocation of shared care periods between the partners, assuming that there is two people involved in the scenario, leaving single parents aside, and actually don't leave them aside. Tell me whether or not you think they should therefore get the entire benefit, which is my view, of course. Thanks, everyone.
It's Lisa Anicia. I'm happy to kick off. If we assume that we're going up to 26 weeks, I think the ratio lends itself to a lot more flexibility. So this is given the 26-week. I think the Grattan Institute put out a really sensible approach, which was 6 weeks, use it or lose it for each parent if there are 2 parents involved. So that takes you to 12 weeks. And then 12 another 12 weeks, which is do whatever you want. So that flexibility and agility for families to structure it how they would like to. And then a 2-week bonus, which is an incentive on the use it or lose it. I think that model could be applied at scale. But I think what we should be aiming for is encouraging, if there are 2 parents, both parents to get involved and trying to create as much flexibility within the policy itself so that it enables families to set themselves up in a way that works best for them.
Ms. Dent.
Does anyone else want to chime in on that? If you have a
I think
contribution.
Ms. Dent was keen to.
I just wanted to reiterate, and we'll say that the Parenthood's position is that if we go to, when we're at 26 weeks, we believe 6 weeks at a minimum should be available for dads on a use it or lose it basis. Our view is that, as has been covered here today, if we want to get to sort of a structural rebalancing of how men and women share the care, that less than 6 weeks is sort of not going to have the structural benefit in actually dividing it. So we would agree that, the Grattan Institute proposal is one that we support, and our position is that 6 weeks at a minimum should be available to men where there is a second parent. When there is a second parent, and when there is not a second parent, we believe the single parent should have the full entitlement.
All right, thank you, Ms. Dent.
Thanks, everyone.
I appreciate all of you bearing through the challenge of providing evidence in a big group like this, but I think what you have provided us has been really valuable today. I really appreciate your time and attendance and support of the committee's work. I don't believe anyone was asked or agreed to take anything on notice, but if you did or there's more information you want to send us, tomorrow is the day that we need to deal with that. We've got quite a short time frame to turn around this report. But other than that, I'll let you all go. Thank you again for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just, Senators, we'll just give everyone a chance to jump off. Okay. I now would like to welcome representatives from the Department of Social Services. Thank you for appearing before the committee today. I again remind committee members that the Senate has resolved that an officer of a department of the Commonwealth or of a state shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. If a witness objects to answering a question, they should state the ground upon which the objection is made, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer, having regard to the ground which is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. Commonwealth officers appearing today are also reminded of the Senate order specifying the process by which a claim of public interest immunity should be raised. A copy of the order is available from the Secretariat. For the Hansard record, could I ask officials to please state their full names and the capacity in which they're appearing today?
Certainly, Chair. So it's Jo Evans, Acting Deputy Secretary, Social Security, Department of Social Services.
Agnieszka Nelson, Branch Manager, Families and Payment Support Branch.
Paul Dowling, Director of Family Payments Policy.
Excellent. Welcome today, to the committee's hearing today. I remind committee members and witnesses who are appearing via video conference and are not speaking to please mute their microphones. And I'd like to invite the department to make an opening statement if you wish to do so.
No opening statement. Thank you, Chair.
Excellent. Look, I'm going to go to Senator Brockman, who's got a couple of questions. I've got a significant number and there may be questions from other senators. So Senator Brockman, let's start with you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Obviously, we've heard today, and it's very clear from submissions that employers and employer groups are broadly supportive of this policy measure. However, one aspect that I have heard on the ground and has been raised in submissions is, I guess, a level of concern from smaller businesses, not about the direct impact, obviously, but about some of the flow-on consequences, particularly in very, very tight labour market environments. Firstly, do you hear those concerns directly when you're interacting with businesses on these types of issues? And if so, because I think part of this is based on perhaps an unnecessary fear. Is there an educative piece that's missing in this space?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. So we have heard those issues, so under the legislative changes that are before the committee now, so there are no changes to what employers will be required to undertake. So as you would be all aware, the connection between the parents and the employers is part of the PPL framework to keep that work connection. What is changing though is the flexibility around when parents might choose to take leave. So if there are enhanced flexibility, it might be the case that small businesses might choose to allow Services Australia to make those payments to the recipient. So at the moment, under the legislation, the employer is required to make the payment if there's a block of leave of 8 weeks or more. If it's less than that, the employee can work with Services Australia and the payment can be made by Services Australia. And the intent of those provisions is to, I guess, minimise the regulatory burden on small business if one of the parents or the parent decides to move to taking every second Friday off, which they're entitled to do under flexibility provisions, but could be seen to be more burdensome on the payroll services of a small business. So in that case, services could make the payments.
Great. So I understand that, but do we think that that information is as yet, or do you have a plan to make sure small businesses understand that?
Thanks, Senator. So Services Australia, our portfolio agency, will be working with business to actually increase awareness around those provisions. And they've come up with our employer toolkit, as they call it, so that there's greater awareness.
Okay. And when does that, is that rolling out already? Is that rolling out once the legislation's passed? What are your timeframes?
They're already providing that information as far as I'm aware. So Services Australia is already working with employers.
Okay. And do we have any, and this is my last question, Chair, do we have any, are we confident that that channel reaches most small employers?
We'd have to, Services Australia would be better placed to answer the specifics around the breadth and the reach of that program because it does sit with them. So I would like to speak on their behalf.
All right. I probably haven't got another opportunity, so I'm happy to leave that one there, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Senator Brockman. I've got quite a number of questions. I'll work through some of them, but I may be putting a bunch to you on notice in the short period of time we have to deal with that, but we'll see what we can get through this afternoon.
Yep.
First question is, what work is currently underway by the department to make sure families know what they're entitled to with these changes? And do you have any communication strategy in the work or communications plan to let families know what their eligibility may be and how to access the scheme?
Certainly. So, Senator, again, so Services Australia will be working through a range of communication material. So at the moment they're in their initial communication phase. So the agency's website has been updated announcing that this legislation has been introduced by the government and it will apply to children born on or after 1 July, subject to the passage of legislation. Following, if the legislation does pass, the communication strategy will then shift and there'll be further information provided about eligibility, how assisting parents with information around how they can apply under the new rules. And then there'll be updated forms, letters, brochures, flyers, you know, the usual delivery that Services Australia does to communicate the changes with the recipients. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Look, throughout the submission process and during today's hearing, we did have some submitters flag the potential risk of financial abuse or coercive control, given the proposed arrangements allow non-birth parents to make the primary paid parental leave claim. What safeguards are in place to manage this risk and to protect victim survivors of family and domestic violence?
Senator, so we're aware of that issue, and one of the protections that we've been working with Services Australia to put in place is an insurance mechanism. So if the claimant is the non-birth parent, so someone other than the birth parent, they must obtain authority from the birth parent before their eligibility can be determined by Services Australia. So Services is looking to put in place an operational ICT change, which actually will facilitate that process. So it's a secure electronic service in which the birthing parent can provide authority to someone else to claim first. Because as the committee would be aware, this is a new change where either parent is able to claim first, but of course we're very conscious that some people can be subject to difficult circumstances and coercive behaviours, and so this is a protection that we've been working with Services Australia to put in place.
Okay, so I assume then to manage that there'll be additional training or resources provided to Services Australia staff?
Yes, so there'll be information provided to services staff. They will also provide information to the birth parent around if someone else has sought authority to claim, that information will go back to the birth parent as well, and then services will work through the provision of that information.
Okay. Another thing that submitters raised was the idea of a reduction or removal of the scheme's work test. Can the department explain the rationale for why those work test provisions were kept as they are?
Sure. And senators, I've been listening to some of the earlier evidence this morning, and just on the work test, there seems to be a little bit of confusion between or the waiting period that applies in relation to private sector provided leave, which has a 12-month waiting period, and then there's the work test in order to access the paid parental leave scheme, but there's no general waiting period.
Well, I have lost audio for you. Yep, and other senators have as well.
Just see if we can get some.
You're back now?
You're back?
Yes.
You're back?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll start again. So just on, so you asked about work test. So I was listening to some of the evidence given earlier this morning, and there seemed to be some discussion or confusion around waiting periods and work tests, and the 12-month waiting period that was discussed applies to private sector leave, but it does not apply to paid parental leave and the government scheme. So I just wanted to clarify that issue for the committee. In terms of the income, the work test, so under the provisions, so the work test remains unchanged. So that is the parents accessing the scheme need to have worked 10 months out of the 13 month in the eligibility period and 330 hours of that period.
Okay. There was also some arguments made for easing the residency test and visa preclusions within the scheme. Can the department explain why the bill doesn't go to these issues?
Sure, Senator. So the newly arrived residents waiting period is something that applies across various social security payments within the architecture of government support. For paid parental leave, the newly arrived residents waiting period is set at 2 years. That said, what I would say is there is a change around residency in the changes that we're proposing here that will further support non-resident birth parents. So previously a non-resident birth parent was not eligible to claim, but under the gender neutral claiming arrangements that are being introduced here, the other parent will be able to claim. And so the other parent, if they meet the residency and the work tests and the income test, then that family would have access to PPL. So that is an improvement under this scheme.
Okay. Another issue which came up in a similar vein was around the ability for more workers to qualify for the scheme. So I'm talking here about casual workers, PhD students, those on temporary or fixed term contracts who are currently, because of the eligibility arrangements, not able to access or participate in the scheme. Was consideration given to how you might be able to bring such workers into this scheme?
Yes, Senator. So, I mean, those workers will be brought into the scheme to the extent they meet the work test that I just ran through. There are other changes around bringing to what was previously the Dad and Partners pay program and bringing that in. The requirements under Dad and Partner pay was such that you couldn't access that, and the committee's again probably aware, you couldn't access that program if you were getting leave from your employer. By rolling this Dad and Partner pay and PLP in together, you can now access, those people can now access the entire 20 weeks, including with leave from their employer. So we expect that that'll see an increased take up under the program.
Okay, there's also been a lot of interest in the use it or lose it provisions, and these provisions are widely welcomed by most submitters to our inquiry, but there was an appetite to see a higher proportion of the leave provided for under a use it or lose it arrangement. Can you explain the rationale as to why the 2-week period was chosen? And can you just clarify, as the scheme ramps up in terms of the total number of weeks, what happens to use it or lose it in the context of that ramp up?
Sure. So the legislation that's before the committee is a 20-week entitlement with 2 weeks use it or lose it. That was the government, their intention was to introduce an initial period of 2 weeks to allow both parents access to the leave entitlement. The government has then sought advice from the Women's Economic Equality Task Force on the exact structure of the use it or lose it provisions as the scheme rolls out to reach the 26 weeks by 2026. So the government's expecting advice from the WEET in the next couple of months, March, April this year, which will inform the next tranche of legislation, which will take effect from 1 July 2024.
Right, so if that advice comes back with a different recommendation, it's possible that government would introduce further changes to the use it or lose it provisions.
That's right.
Okay. The other issue which came up frequently related to the paying of superannuation on these payments, and this is something a number of submitters called for. Can the department just go to the rationale behind why superannuation wasn't included, and if there's been any consideration looking at that in the future?
Yes, Senator. So the department's aware of the calls for super on PPL. We have, looked at that issue, including with our colleagues at the Treasury Department. We've looked at recommendations from the Retirement Income Review. The findings of the Retirement Income Review found that by the time a woman reaches retirement age, interactions with the age pension mean that the impact of super on PPL would not have I think it was 0.017% change, so quite small. So I think their findings were there are other things that would be more beneficial to women if you were looking to address super balances. But as you're aware, the legislation before the committee doesn't have super on PPL changes.
Comparisons were made throughout the submission process and today between the scheme as it's laid out in this bill and best practice models such as in Nordic countries. How would the department sort of characterise this piece of reform in the context of what's happening globally, and particularly in comparison with relative comparative countries, for instance, OECD countries?
Yeah. And again, we were listening to Dr. Rees this morning and others who have made those comparisons, and the Nordics being best practice, including breaking down gender norms. What we would say aligns with what she was saying, including around tax and social security arrangements. So the tax arrangements in the Nordics are different to Australia. The social security arrangements in Australia are non-contributory. So that is, they're entitlement based, and if someone meets the income and work tests in this case, then they're entitled. So there's no other requirement to contribute. Other countries do have contributory paid parental leave and social security arrangements so that workers essentially put money aside for those schemes. So I think the fundamental difference between the Australian scheme and many other schemes is really that contributory nature versus the taxpayer-funded scheme that Australia has. Oh, we can't hear.
That is a technical error on my behalf rather than a broader technical problem, sorry. Another area which we didn't really discuss as much in today's hearings, but I know has come up in submissions, but for single parents, can you just step through how they're impacted by the use it or lose it provisions and the sharing of entitlement?
Sure, Senator. So for single parents accessing the paid parental leave under the new changes from 1 July, they would be entitled to access the entire 20-week entitlement period. So while other parents, if there are two parents in the relationship, then they would have a 2-week each use it or lose it provision. Single parents would be entitled to the entire 20-week period.
So there's no loss of entitlement overall for single parents because of that?
Absolutely not, Senator. No.
Okay. I did have another question about transitional arrangements. Oh, actually, before I get to that one though, if you were listening today, there was also a concern raised around the lack of a review mechanism in this legislation, that under the previous introduction there was a review mechanism, but there wasn't one in this bill. So is that something you can respond to?
Yes, Senator. So the budget measure that the government took that was included in the October budget included provision for evaluation of the new changes, and so that evaluation will be taking place over coming years and reflected back in the next tranche of legislation. Yeah.
Right, okay. All right. And then just finally on the bill's transitional arrangements, could you just go into these in a little bit more detail for us and the rationale behind these transitional arrangements?
Specifically on from where we are now through to 1 July?
Yes.
Yes. So there's a pre-claim period for access to paid parental leave. So that's an existing feature of the current arrangement, where around 3 months prior to the birth of your child, you can lodge a pre-claim. So that is to allow parents to be in the situation to have everything sorted with Services Australia, and then not in the situation of having to deal with a new baby and put in place claims for PPL. So for the new legislative changes, that pre-claim period will commence in March, so it's the 26th of March. So pre-claims can be lodged for babies that will be born from or after 1 July 2023.
Okay. And I know I said that was the last question. I just want to circle back to our discussion around the use it or lose it provisions and the work the task force is doing on those which could inform future changes or policy decisions. Is there anything else that task force is looking at which is relevant to this bill or these issues that we should be aware of as a committee?
I think it's primarily around I'm just looking at my colleagues. Concurrency. So this is the issue, Senator, around whether both parents can access days at the same time. So the WEET is going to come back and give advice to government on that issue.
Okay. But not, so in terms of the rate of the payment, is that something, an increase to the rate of the parental leave payment, which is currently paid for at minimum wage, was considered?
That's not something that's currently within the scope of the WEET advice.
And so was that something considered by the department? It was something raised by submitters to this inquiry?
So the department's aware of calls for changes in the rate of payment.
Okay. Senator Waters, that was a big burst of questions from me. I'll go to you now, and then if there's more time at the end, I'll come back with a couple more. Senator Waters.
Thanks very much, Chair. And you helpfully asked a couple of questions that I had on my list, so that reduces mine down. Can I harken back firstly, and thanks to the departmental folk for all your work on this and your time today. Just coming back to super, which the Chair asked you about, did you cost how much it would be to the budget if super was to be paid on PPL?
I'd have to take on it, so not in the context of this piece of legislation, Senator. So over, you know, in the course of our work over years, it may have been undertaken previously, but not in the context of this piece of legislation.
Did you refer to any of that previous work when you were undertaking the work on this legislation in relation to the cost of super?
I would have to take that on notice.
Okay, thank you. And I just didn't quite catch what you said before. I've jotted down 0.7%. Was that a reference to the amount of super that a worker ends up with at the end of their work life, and it's only a 0.7% difference if super was paid on PPL versus if it was not? Is that what that figure was?
Yeah, so that's what the Mike Cahallahan Retirement Income Review finding was, that because of interactions with the age pension, it actually it doesn't have a significant shift on in terms of influencing retirement incomes of women.
Oh, okay, that's news to me. That's contrary to what I thought was the case. So perhaps would you mind just taking on notice to interrogate that a little and just check on the influence of compound interest there? Because I really was operating under the assumption that there was that the retirement income gap of roughly 50%, whereby women retire with roughly half the super of men, was quite a large part influenced by the care breaks, and I had assumed that super on PPL would form quite a proportion of that. So thanks for just taking that on notice to either set me straight or give me some interesting reading. Can I ask now, again, you mentioned how you deal with coercive control and other domestic and family violence situations in relation to your proposed authority portal. But my question is, how will Services Australia staff know if the consent is given freely, and what sort of facility will there be to check whether it was given freely?
That's certainly an area of concern. I'd have to go back again. I'll take it on notice and go back to my colleagues at Services Australia and just come back to the committee with a bit more detail around exactly how that will work.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And perhaps in the course of doing so, you could also ask whether there's any, or you may know whether there's any provision in the legislation around denying authority when there's a grounded suspicion that consent was not given freely in those sorts of violent relationships.
I think that's right, Senator. So we'll be putting in place rules where the use it or lose it provisions won't be entitled to be. So someone who's experiencing family and domestic violence doesn't need to, for example, share the lose it or use it provisions. Yes. And so they could access the entire 20 weeks. So those special circumstances will be going into rules to provide added protections there.
I'm glad to hear that. But again, if you could just advise me either now or on notice, what burden of proof, what does the victim survivor have to demonstrate in order to show that the sharing of care would not be appropriate in their situation, which sadly no doubt happens far more than it should. And lastly, when you check with Services Australia, could you just ascertain from them whether there's any requirement to refer victim survivors to support services when that issue of consent and violence is raised?
Certainly, Senator. Come back.
Thank you. Thank you. And now I've just got a specific scenario. You did mention the work test already. I've been contacted by pregnant parents who are currently undertaking, one person in particular who's currently undertaking postgrad uni under the government's RTP scholarship. And she said that the work test means that she's not eligible for PPL. Presumably that's because she doesn't meet the 10 out of 13 months of working because she's doing study. Can you just let me know, is that correct? And is there any, how can that be fixed? Is there any work being done to fix that? Because my understanding is that those scholarships are below the minimum wage. So not being able to access PPL while you're already subsisting on a below the minimum wage scholarship is really not a great financial situation for anyone to be in, let alone someone who's about to have a baby.
Senator, that is correct. So the PPL scheme does require the connection to work, and that doesn't include connection to study under the current legislation.
Was there any consideration done on if someone is doing a scholarship, like they're otherwise a worker, but they've just gone back to do further study, which would, assist them to either go back to the same work and seek promotion or just generally add to their skills? Was there any consideration given to changing that as a policy position?
I'd have to take that on notice, what
Okay.
were the exact parameters of what was undertaken. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'd also like to know whether or not the department was consulted about the administrative implications of the gradual step up to 26 as opposed to an immediate increase to 26. And have you assessed the confusion that might reign when new parents are seeking to apply, and also the inequity between parents in that years between now and 2020, whenever it is that the 2026 is met? Sorry,
so
you know what I mean in that last bit.
So the department provided a range of advice to government in the lead up to the October budget that included the announcement of the staged implementation of the PPL changes up through to 26 weeks in 2026.
Okay, thanks for that illuminating response. Can I ask now about families where the birth parent is in Australia but doesn't have a residency and therefore they're not themselves eligible, but their partner is resident and is eligible, but is the only income earner and can't afford to live on minimum wage for the PPL period? Does that mean that sort of family would miss out?
So under the current arrangement, that family would be missing out. From 1 July, that family, the resident partner would be able to apply and would be able to access the paid parental leave under the scheme.
Okay, but it wouldn't be
if they meet the residency and the work test, yeah.
Okay, but they might not be able to afford to live on the minimum wage and therefore they might not access it. Okay, understand. And can I just check, I think there was one more question that I had. Just bear with me while I operate the tech here. Okay. Yes, so you mentioned there was I think you said a 3-month pre-eligibility period whereby you can apply before the 1st of July in order to have the benefit of PPL post 1 July 2023. If you've made your pre-claim for a bub that's due after the 1st of July, but if bubba comes early, are those people eligible?
So those people would be, because the legislation takes effect from 1 July, if bub comes early and arrives on the 29th of June, that family would be eligible for the arrangements under the current legislation.
Okay, so even if they've pre-applied and they're expecting the little one to arrive under the new arrangements, if through no fault of their own, because these things can sometimes happen, baby comes early, they don't get, even if they've pre-applied.
That's right, because the legislation takes effect from 1 July. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Last question for me, did you give any, is there any quantification for the likely number of people that might fall into that category?
I don't think we've done that analysis.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks,
Thank you, Chair.
Senator.
Thank you. I'll just check. I understand Senator Brockman has no further questions. Were there any other questions from other senators of the department? No? Okay, I've got one more question coming to you, which I'll place on notice as well. So I'm sure you'll be eagerly anticipating that. Thank you for your attendance this afternoon. That concludes our hearing today. We'd like to thank all witnesses who have appeared before us and to Hansard and Broadcasting for their assistance. The committee has agreed that responses to questions on notice should be provided by tomorrow, 21 February 2023. That's to enable us to conclude our report in the short timeframes we need to in order for this to be enacted. The committee now stands adjourned. So thanks again and have a nice afternoon.
Thanks, Chair.